Spinoza. The second, of course, is Nietzsche and the will to power.
Mhm.
Will to power, the Machen and Konatas are always already operative in a positive way, and they're trying to avoid the negative of lack, right, in terms of desire. That somehow in the psychoanalytic history, the history of psychoanalysis, desire was always related to lack. You have something I
Mhm.
want, or I want to take your place, or in Lacanian section, I want to take the place of the other, or something like that. They're trying to avoid that because they, again, I think they're, in some ways certainly more Marxist than psychoanalytic in this work
Mhm.
as well. And you have to always remember this is a social, the socius is always determinate in the beginning.
Ah,
And I like when you said the privatization of desire, because for them, desire is social. Going again, returning, cycling back, if you will, to where you began with this dilemma of the masses knew exactly what they were getting. And I think this is a great insight. Noam Chomsky, for example, he thinks if
mhm.
we only knew, we would change things. That's not the case at all. This is the
Yeah,
worst
no.
part of Chomskyan politics in a way. He has so
Mhm.
many followers and he's so great, but no, that's not true. We all know it's shit, right? We see it every day. We know exactly what we got with biding time. We know exactly where we are in a sense, but do we really act in this context? That's another thing. So they're basically they're, if you will, for lack of again another term, their dualism or their working moments right here are also about the desire, in the head that wants this. And desire is both reactionary and revolutionary. And sometimes this reactionary part of desire takes over. And as you've said, yes, the German people, the Italians to a degree, all knew exactly maybe what they were getting, or, just turned the head another way or whatever. I don't think it's everybody. I don't think everybody's that conscious, but the people, many people knew, right? and went along with it. And, I recommend a TV series in case you haven't seen it. I think the new version is out, Babylon Berlin,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
you know,
For sure.
on Netflix, which is really worthwhile because it kind of gives you the background to Weimar and Weimar that is really desiring these things in a way, right? And
Mhm.
and this painter that they the boy with machine, Richard Linder, who by the way, Josh taught at Pratt Institute for a while back in the day. Linder is part of the German Expressionist movement, which had a very, very close tie to, quote, fascist desire in many ways. This, I'm not saying Boy with Machine is that way, but they're looking at that. I think Boy with Machine is a way of saying, I don't need the family, I'm just connected to the social machine. So
Mhm.
I think, again, yes, this is what they're really trying to do, but I don't think, as you said, and you posed the problem, which is a good way of posing it, that they are overcoming, quote, reactionary desire or the desire to be dominated or the desire for servitude. Again, their problematic is why do we choose, servitude rather than freedom? This great ethical question that we're still faced with in many ways. Yeah. So I think we ought to look at this process more and more as we go forward, into the schizoid, the tasks of schizoid analysis. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in the chapter tonight, the second part of holy familialism. So I don't know if I addressed your question adequately, David, but I'm trying to at least problematize it or give us a sense of, where they are here. I don't think they're trying to provide answers immediately. I think they're trying to build something outside of what they consider an impasse in psychoanalytic thinking, and what you basically called, and it's a wonderful phrase, I'll probably repeat it 10 times tonight, the privatization of desire, or the production of desire too, which is a social element. And again, they're always looking at this from the outside, right? They do not like, again, these models of the neurotic on the couch or the psychotic anymore. And Freud didn't like psychotics. That's another thing they want to go to as well. And yeah, and Freud didn't like, and this is another thing that I was doing a little bit. I was reading Ferenczi, who was Clinical Diary and etc., who actually would engage in the inner subjectivity of the patient, of the analyst's arm, which Freud was very much against, being this detached model from the analyst has to remain neutral, should never become involved in with the patient, right? There was a big issue about this in terms of forensics clinical. I think her name was Elizabeth Severin. Severin was the case who became, a kind of wayward psychoanalyst. I mean, that Freud, said, you're not part of this, much like Lacan did with, I forgot her name, what was her name? The philosopher, Lucia Igagari. Yeah,
right.
yeah. So, and on the feminist stuff, that feminist move against.
Yeah, I was going to say something.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's important to keep this in mind if we can hold that, and maybe when we get to the tasks of schizoid analysis, we might be able to evaluate better, towards the end of the book, or the flow book, if you will, how they try to start setting up something for the future, in terms of the anti-psychiatry, the anti-Oedipal. For them, look, Freud is really a bourgeois reader still for them. They really think this in a sense, and this whole notion of the privatization, or what Foucault said, that Freud's genius was to bring the madness of the asylum to the couch, right? And it fully privatized something that had an external moment in the 19th century with the asylums, the Pinel, that Foucault does so beautifully in terms of representation, and the clinics and the asylums that work in the 19th century. So for Foucault, Freud's great contribution in a way was the replacement, if you will, of the asylum to the couch, right, in a way, and this privatized neurosis, etc. Again, from the opening of the book, the antagonism, the attack is against that of the neurotic on the couch. Yeah, because the neurotic can be readapted, can be re-Oedipalized, and it comes down again to the family narration. It comes back to structure, Oedipus' structure, etc. So this, remember, keep this in mind. And again, why they listen to some of the most, experimental fiction out there. It's not standard narrative. It's not Goethe. They're, Goethe is very important to Marcuse in Eros and Civilization. But in a sense, this is much more the Hölderlin, the contemplative, withdrawal of a Hölderlin, the madness of the Nietzsche. I want to reread today, because I think the two signposts in some ways for schizoid analysis and where they're going in terms of if you want to look at this in terms of a poiesis and and signposts, if you will, for the future. There's a wonderful passage early in the book. We've already read it, looked at it, but I want to go back to it, in the name of, quote, repetition. This is on page, at least in my text, in the first section, page, and excuse my light, I'm going to put it down a little bit. Yeah, this is wonderful here. This is on page 20, and this is a reading of Pierre Klossowski's, and if you haven't read Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, it's certainly worth reading. It's one of the most brilliant interpretations, if not the best, of Nietzsche in terms of a textual analysis of Nietzsche as philosopher. Okay, Klossowski is admirably demonstrated in his commentary on Nietzsche. The president of the Stimmung, which means both determination and attunement, is probably a better way. Stimmung is a kind of an attunement. Heidegger uses this word. It's a very active German word around. As a material emotion, constitutive of the most lawfully thought and the most acute perception. And this is very interesting on eternal recurrence of the same, one of the best definitions I've ever seen. The centrifugal forces do not flee the center forever, but approach it once again, only to retreat from it yet again. Such is the nature of the violent oscillations that overwhelm an individual so long as he seeks only his own center and is incapable of seeing the circle of which he himself is a part. For if these oscillations overwhelm him, it is because each one of them corresponds to an individual other than the one he believes himself to be, from the point of view of the unlocatable center. As a result, an identity is essentially fortuitous, and a series of individualities must be undergone by each of these oscillations, so that as a consequence, the fortuitousness of this or that particular individuality will render all of them necessary. And then Deleuze and Guattari comment. The forces of attraction and repulsion, of soaring ascents and plunging falls, produce a series of intensive states based on the intensity equals zero that designates the body without organs. But as was most usual here is that, again, a new afflux is necessarily merely to signify this absence. There's no Nietzsche the self, professor of philology, who suddenly loses his mind and supposedly identifies with all sorts of strange people. Rather, there is the Nietzschean subject who passes through a series of states and who identifies these states with the names of history. Every name in history is I, or I am all the names in history. The subject spreads itself out along the entire circumference of the circle, the center of which has been abandoned by the ego. At the center is the desiring machine, the celibate machine of the eternal return. A residual subject of the machine, Nietzsche as subject, garners a euphoric reward, voluptas, from everything that this machine turns out, a product that the reader has thought to be no more than the fragmented oeuvre of Nietzsche. Nietzsche believes that he is now pursuing not the realization of a system, but the application of a program in the form of residues of the Nietzschean discourse, which have now become the repertory, so to speak, of the histrionism. It is not a matter of identifying with various historical personages, but rather identifying the names of history with zones of intensity on the body without organs. And each time Nietzsche as subject exclaims, "They're me, so it's me," no one has been as deeply involved as history as the schizoid or dealt with it in this way. He consumes all of universal history in one full swoop. We began by defining him as homo natura, and lo and behold, he has become homo historia. This long road, and this is beautiful here, these are the two signposts, that leads from the one to the other, stretches from Hölderlin to Nietzsche, I would add from Spinoza to Hölderlin to Nietzsche, but anyway, and the pace becomes faster and faster. Again, a quote, "The euphoria could not be prolonged in Nietzsche for as long a time as the contemplative alienation of Hölderlin. The vision of the world granted to Nietzsche does not inaugurate a more or less regular succession of landscapes or still lifes extending over a period of 40 years or so. It is rather, and this is wonderful, a parody of the process of recollection of an event. A single actor will play the whole of it in pantomime in the course of a single solemn day, because the whole of it reaches expression and then disappears once again in the space of just one day, even though it may appear to have taken place between December 31st and January 6th in a realm above and beyond the usual rational calendar." Speaking about this great insight of the eternal recurrence of the same coming to Nietzsche. What I like here is this can be very much related to Marx's 18th Brumaire, Louis Napoleon, the first time these things appear as tragedy, the second, Hegel forgot to add, the second time as farce, but also going even further into pantomime, further than pastiche. Maybe that's where we are, this kind of whole universal as pantomime, a new kind of thinking of repetition and recurrence, outside of what we traditionally have known, or the compulsion to repeat in clinical terms. So I really like this. I mean, for me, this is a very interesting section about where they really want to go. If you begin to think of this, the words of threshold, the world of intensities All of these things are what are operative. If we can concentrate on that in some ways, I think we may get somewhere, because they're always looking at threshold, intensity, in this way. Bruno used the word epiphany. I'm not crazy about that, but epiphany can also be included in this too, in the discussion instead of event. I still like event, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was it was Richard who used it, and then
Yeah, right,
I
right. You
commented on
referred
it.
to it. Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
then I
right,
commented on
right.
it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, I don't know if this helped, but if we begin to think of this as this way of looking, again, Nietzsche is crucial here. This is a historical, to my mind, the encounter in this book between the two of the three of the unholy trinity, if you will, of modernity, and really in a different way, post-modernity, post-structuralism, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, right? This is an encounter between really Marx and Nietzsche, right? In many ways. And Nietzsche is being positioned in terms of a positive rather than the negative, that Deleuze and Guattari think that Freud and Lacan are engaged in terms of desire.
Michael, what page were you
That's
reading
right.
from? What just
Yes, I'm sorry, Carl. Yeah, yeah.
oh, what page were you on when you were
I was
reading?
on. I was reading the section. The sentence began. I'm sorry, I'm in an older edition, page 20. This is what Kloskowski, Pierre Kloskowski, the Polish
Oh, okay,
French,
okay.
yeah. And it was this long section on Nietzsche and Hölderlin, which was really beautiful. How about we got to the eternal recurrence of the same? To my mind, it's the Hölderlin, and I guess everybody knows the story, right? Hölderlin, Hegel, and Schelling, were very good friends when they went to the university. And at the university, they had a tree of liberty, right? They found it, and they were very good friends. Hölderlin went mad. Schelling became the most popular professor. Then Hegel became in competition with Schelling at the university for a while. And, the Schellingian system was taken on by Hegel in early writings, 1803, the difference between the Fichtean and Schelling systems of difference. So all the talk about difference and repetition and difference and difference in the Derridian sense have a kind of marking point, if you will, in the history of philosophy in this 1803 text of Hegel. Hölderlin goes mad. Some people think he feigns madness, but it's hard to believe that he goes into this contemplative alienation by choice only. I don't know, but some people have suggested that and written about this. But as you know, Hölderlin, it was Heidegger writes of Hölderlin going mad when he's translating the section on Eros in Antigone from ancient Greek into German. That he, in the translation of the Antigone, he goes mad when he's in the moment of translation. This is where the mark is, according to Heidegger, where Hölderlin loses, quote unquote, loses it, so to speak. Yeah. And
There was just one thing.
yeah,
There was another section somewhere in the text. I'm not finding it right now, where they
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
sure.
return to this theme of the schizophrenic, and sort of all of history and all of society and politics becomes sort of the terrain in which they perform these operations. And it just made me think. It's interesting, just like when I used to work in mental health, oftentimes there like a lot of delusional, for lack
I'm
of
sorry, your microphone is a little bit low tonight. I'm sorry, I'm just
Oh,
taking
I was just saying,
yeah,
it just
yeah.
made me think about, my interactions with people who are schizophrenic, and how often, if they're talking to themselves or talking on the street, or, they're often engaged in political dialogues, talking about, historical events, political events. And I think it was just interesting how, you know, thinking about that, and also when I worked in mental health, how it was a long time ago, but how I was working with people who were generally diagnosed as schizophrenic, and often their hallucinations, or what they would be talking about, was not centered on their family, for sure. It was very, very different. So
Well, I mean, you're actually giving some evidence, if you will, Exhibit A to the Deleuzian, Guattarian hypothesis here, right? In
yeah,
some
it seems
sense.
like
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
what's being appropriated and transformed and recoded, decoded, whatever words we want
Right,
to use, or the
right,
delusional system, or the what have you, is very infused with social, political, often paranoid themes. There's often a very
right,
strong
right,
paranoid
right.
aspect to it. But it's interesting. I just thought that was interesting.
For them, paranoia is associated with power, whereas the schizophrenic has no indication of power either. And I'm not talking about Nietzschean will to power, which is a very different thing. Eloy, you had your hand up, please. Yeah, yeah. We need to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I just it's related with what Carl mentioned. No Karl Marx, but Carl Weitel.
Okay.
Um, very similar. No, no, but it's rather a question. I was wondering to how capitalism uh, produce schizophrenia, and to which mediations in the work of these guys. I haven't figured out that.
Okay. Well, let me just say this. Next week, the reading will be on that section of where they try to look at this through originary accumulation. There's a very active reading here of originary accumulation, otherwise known as primitive accumulation, but the German word is Ursprung. So it's really the originary springing forth of accumulation and how accumulation works. And this is their notion of territorial that they will come up with. And then again, that the schizoid, and also, of course, when people were forced from the farms to the textile mills, deterritorialization. This has many material locations in history as well. We can begin to think about this as we go forward. Yeah. So yeah, a very good point. But I mean, next week it's in the reading, and there is this kind of presupposition about originary accumulation and the beginning of the territorial machines, right? Of which then we get the notion of deterritorialization. And I'll talk about that. That's another term that's being operative here. Right now, we're still with desiring production, holy familialism. These are the kind of crucial terms of, right? How lack is being, substituted by affirmative desire. The notion of desiring machine as a social moment, and it's not machinic or machinic. And I think Lydia's here. Some people, and thank you, Josh. I got the French. I've been trying to read that alongside. Yeah, and there's a lot of play of language in the French that we really don't get as well in the English. Yeah, and yeah, but anyway, yeah, we'll go back to that. I mean, again, tonight I'm really interested in this question of servitude and what David began us with about the desire of the masses for fascism, right? And I mean, I can talk about movies. I mean, again, if you look at that wonderful film with Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling, God, why am I blocking on the title? The Night Porter, right? I mean, really, in a way, that's a film really about desire, and desire and domination, and desire, the reactionary desire in one. You have a whole slew of movies during this period about that. Of course, Salo, another, extreme version of reactionary desire too. Yeah. This is something that I think still, perplexes, and still, something we have to engage in many ways. I think it's, look, I'm very big on, hopefully Bessemer, Alabama, becomes a site of real struggle for the new labor unions. I understand this as part of the social narrative and stuff, but I'm the last part. I think joining a labor union these days, in a way, I mean, it might be helpful in the beginning, but most labor unions are more oppressive than ever, right? The complete decline, company unions everywhere. Desire is no longer about the freedom of the worker. It's about, basically, a kind of safety net or security. It's not about making the workplace better or about changing work relations. So this is something I think we really have to face, as we go forward. That the Anti-Oedipus and other critiques like this, open up for us, yeah, in terms of our own world. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So Eloy, if you don't mind, I'll hold it to next week. It's a good question. They're going to talk about originary accumulation, and i.e. primitive accumulation. But you can read this at one level, vis-a-vis Marx, if you're reading volume 1 of Capital, at the end, the immediate processes of production, right, in a way. This is always already going on, but the immediate processes of production are both the production and the product together, in terms of this socius that they do. So again, they're merging a lot of terms in order to avoid, a kind of binary systems. Anyway, yeah, some other thoughts. I mean, again, I recommend Klossowski's work. This is a major thinker, someone very underrepresented in scholarship and in discussion especially in the United States, but everywhere. Art and Text, by the way, in Australia, had a whole issue devoted to Klossowski. I think it was about 20 years ago. A very good issue that was completely devoted to the work of his, including writings of his, plus a lot of his photography. He wasn't the most he certainly wasn't a unperverse person, to put it mildly. But anyway, he understood. Yeah. Anyway, very different. Yeah. And I think I told you Fred Jameson said that he was the most intelligent person of the 20th century. So anyway, yeah, whatever that means. But yeah. I mean, you can make cases for a lot of people that way. So yeah, anybody else, any thoughts? Yeah, Josefa, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if the reading you just read about Nietzsche and his will to power. I was wondering if this is related to Deleuze and Guattari, in the sense that Nietzsche was trying to get away from this codification of desire, let's say, using those terms, of Christianity, right? Christianity, sets up a code of, what's a good and what's, I think in that essay about the some birds of prey or something like that. I don't know, do I get that title? Nietzsche's Birds of Prey or something like that. Do you remember?
Yeah, philosophers are birds of prey. Yeah. Right. Yeah, he uses the metaphor birds of prey. Yes. Right. In a way. Yeah.
Yeah. This code of what's good and what's bad, and that's respond to
right.
Live. So I was wondering if that is related to also the flow. In case of the Oedipus complex, it's a code that makes you feel guilty, or that kind of codifies your desire and fixes it as a triangle of the family, let's say. So I wonder if that can be equated, or what do you think about, this? Because I think.
Well, I think it's a complete assault by Nietzsche on the notion of guilt, in the genealogy of morals. I mean, he is really opening that up in such a way that I don't think Freud touches. Freud thinks about it and understands it, right? But I don't think Freud stays with that kind of codification going forward. The superego and the notion of guilt is very active in psychoanalytic practice, etc. Is that how you relate to guilt in a way? Is it responsibility? Sartre, I know, said about himself he had a super ego because he didn't have a father. He was raised by his mother, right? And he had full possession of his mother early on, so he developed a super ego, which made him super responsible, which may give us some kind of model of explanation of why Sartre became so much about freedom and agency, and the responsibility for one's actions at all costs, which was a kind of rethinking of the Kantian morality. on one hand. But I think that the interesting thing that you bring up here is that, with Nietzsche, in a way, they would consider, and I'm projecting my own Nietzschean thought onto this, they would consider Freud and psychoanalysis somewhat to be part of the pattern of the Judaic Christian codification of what you just mentioned, guilt, right, and shame, and all of these kind of matters that are still working out, and they want to avoid that. And they're using Nietzsche in a sense to get out, especially Deleuze, who's, as you know, he has 2 books on Nietzsche underneath his belt by this time, including the book that sees Nietzsche as active forces, right, versus reactive forces. And again, this notion of the will as an active moment, as creative, as desiring, versus that of trying to, fill a lack, fill the empty spaces is going on. So I don't know if that helped, but anyway, the guilt is something they really want to. Deleuze also wrote an essay called "I Have Nothing to Confess," and in a way, does psychoanalysis in some way? It's not supposed to be this way, but did it replace the Catholic confessional? That's another thing, and the funny scenes and the conformist and Il Conformista when he goes to the priest, right, to talk about his thing. And, you have many parodies of this in film and etc. And Louis Buñuel is a great example of, I think, deconstructing. His whole life is about, his whole filmic career is about getting rid of the Catholic Church. And I don't know if you remember the last film, That Obscure Object of Desire, and the last terrorist organization was the Revolutionary Society for the Infant Jesus. This was during the Basque uprisings, during all the moments in Europe. So, I mean, I think they're poking fun at this in a sense. And yeah, Nietzsche's very, I think alongside this book, it would be great to reread, if you haven't read it, to read The Genealogy of Morals. It's something that should be read every year, especially the sections on bad and good conscience, right? And the whole strategy. For Deleuze and Guattari, I'm clear about this. For them, the attack about the holy familialism and the Anti-Oedipus in some ways is an attack upon ressentiment and how energy can get stuck in ressentiment, and the ressentiment and that feeling, that material emotion, if you will, and that kind of practice in the world leads to recodification completely and actually ends up as reactionary desire, where David began, with, the masses sometimes desire and know exactly what they're getting, that the ressentiment is what does it. And what are the fascists? The fascists are really good at playing the ressentiment. Donald Trump was perfect at doing this. Think about this, where the model is, what they play upon in terms of their, attractions, right? They don't play on, we're going to be sensitive and we need to be caring about, this and that. This isn't the liberal approach at all. Yeah, in a way. So they're out there in terms of trying to channel and redirect the ressentiment. And it seems to me political battles in the 20th century, in a way, and Nietzsche understood this very well too. And I think this is one of the reasons. And again, I'm not saying that he's right here. Please don't hear me this way, but in a way, the French Revolution to him was Christianity repeated, right? In a sense, it was a Christian reaction. It was a reaction of ressentiment for him, right? The Paris Commune, he got sick on the day of the Paris Commune. There's a very much of a third way, here at work. And and I know that Lasorda's book, I'm sorry to make these references, but I think it's important. Lasorda's book is going to be out in about another week or two. I think it's already out, actually, the 1300, The Rebel Aristocrat of I think. And Deleuze never really was Deleuze never went to meetings. He just thought these things were wastes of time. They asked him, why didn't you join the party, or why didn't you have fellow travel? He says, all they do is talk. I just waste my time. I'd rather be writing or reading. So there are personal elements at work here too. But I think this category for today's thinking psychic and social repression, ressentiment is a very crucial category going forward, absolutely crucial. And that the political struggles are always about, left and right in a way, is how do you redirect ressentiment? Yeah, how do you take this, I'd rather be something else. How am I projecting the hostility onto the world? How does this mobilize, etc.? And again, another category there after too is sublimation. They don't really believe in sublimation in the Freudians, and we'll get to that when we maybe get to the section on psychic and social repression. So anyway, I'm glad you brought up Nietzsche. Again, I think Nietzsche is very crucial here, in terms of this, again, the category of ressentiment. Nietzsche to me is really a very different path politically, and in a sense, the attempted Marx Nietzschean syntheses sometimes just don't work, but we can talk more about that, in terms of Nietzsche's actual, logic ultimately. But Nietzsche is absolutely behind this movement. I'm convinced, right? And being used both for and against Freud. Yeah, and yeah. I guess historically, that Freud was very fond of Nietzsche, but he mentioned in his autobiography that he never read Nietzsche because he was afraid he would be too, it was a higher level that he could never attain. So he was afraid of this. Of course, he read Nietzsche, and he was very close for part of the, with Lou Andreas Salome, who was Nietzsche's, quote, muse, and, friend and confidant for many years, it's another aspect of this. So anyway, I'd like to, any other thoughts about this? I mean, the role of Nietzsche. Again, I really recommend, rereading of the Genealogy of Morals. The Will to Power are fragments. There are 1,000, I think, 44 fragments that are put together and organized by Walter Kaufmann after World War II. He never politicized them. The notebooks of Nietzsche show that he wanted to build a political system, and those were the notes towards it, that he considered himself a new Machiavelli, in many ways. And this is a kind of interesting, what would a Nietzschean politics look like? I really don't know. I think we need to, again, speculate on that in a different way, but again, vis-a-vis Freud, not Marx, because I don't think that's ressentiment is not in Marx, right? More inventive and creativity. Yeah. They invent the term proletariat. They're not of the proletariat, right? They're for the proletariat, but they invent the term proletariat. Yeah. So these are other things worth considering, and this. Yeah. So Carl. Yeah.
Oh, well, continue. I just had at some point just questions about what seems to me a complex relationship to Oedipus and the family, and how they understand Oedipus in relation to the unconscious and what they're doing. But I think maybe we could wait on that.
Well, what in particular? Because it seems to me they want to be rid of Oedipus. I mean, it's both somewhat for in terms of reading it as symptom, but at the same time a way of ridding themselves of it so that they could get on to other things. It's kind of like the belief system that they go through, when the death of God reaches the conscious mind from the unconscious or whatever, the conscious mind says, okay, so what? And then you realize it was a belief system, right? In a sense. And I think they're doing somewhat some of the same thing with the Oedipus thing, even though it's much more part of the culture, right? I mean, So but I mean, tell me what aspects in terms of the relationship.
We all
sorry.
want to be rid of the Oedipus complex.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we all want to be rid of our Oedipal complex. So but I understand that they're working at a different level. I guess my thoughts aren't well organized about this, but it just comes back to, you know, the question of the family and social repression. And on the one
Okay.
hand, there's this passage, it's on page 74.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay.
They
And
talk
just for
about,
I'm sorry, I have a different edition. You must be using the Penguin. I have the old
yeah,
Minnesota edition, but please, yeah. Just
yeah,
tell me
so
the
I think
first
it's
paragraph.
on, you know, where they say, maybe it's not on 74, where they say that we don't deny that there is an Oedipal uh, aspect to, you know, that they're not denying Oedipus exists and Oedipal sexuality, Oedipal forms of desire, but that what they're denying is that those are the products of the unconscious. And then, so I thought oh yeah, it's right at the top. We do not deny that there is an Oedipal sexuality and Oedipal heterosexuality and homosexuality, and Oedipal castration, as well as complete objects, global images, and specific egos. We deny that these are productions of the unconscious, and then they kind of go. So, you know, that's interesting, and then they come back, and then this is, you know, where they're talking about the family, and it's almost like they're talking about the family and the parents as inducers, right? The stimulus, and that then they talk about how Oedipus arises, it seems to then be, this is on page 129, where they're first talking about like the family and Oedipus as sort of a system of social repression. That's how I read it. And then they say that Oedipus is a reaction formation, a formation that results from a reaction to desiring production. So it seems that I found that a little confusing, but I'm just, you know, it seems like on the one hand they're saying that the unconscious sort of doesn't produce Oedipus, but on the other hand that there is sort of, the family is sort of this stimulant, this inductor, as it were, and as the agent that imposes a certain kind of repression, the Oedipal complex almost emerges out of these operations. I mean, it just wasn't clear to me, like how they're, and maybe this is, you know, I agree with what Richard said last week, that this is probably not the most important thing they're doing, you know, ultimately in the book. But I just wondered if other people had thoughts or ideas about
Yeah,
how.
sure. I'll open that up to the group. I just want to mention, though, at the end of that section 3 of the section you read, and I have a different, no, but it's the connective synthesis of production, right? It's a connective synthesis going on, right? At this point, right? And he says, and they say, for a simple reason, we again make use of Kantian terminology in what he termed the critical revolution. This is right before section 4 in Holy Familialism. Kant intended to discover criteria, and again, this is important because there's a search for criteria, imminent to understanding so as to distinguish the legitimate and illegitimate uses of the syntheses of consciousness, okay? In the name of transcendental philosophy, immanence of criteria, he therefore denounced the transcended use of syntheses such as appeared in metaphysics. In like fashion, we are compelled to say that psychoanalysis has its metaphysics. Its name is Oedipus. And that a revolution, this time materialist, can proceed only by way of a critique of Oedipus, by denouncing the illegitimate use of the synthesis of the unconscious as found in Oedipal psychoanalysis, not the unconscious itself, and unconscious as found in Oedipal psychoanalysis, so as to rediscover a transcendental unconscious defined by the immanence of its criteria and a corresponding practice that we will call schizoid analysis. So again, they're trying to set the frame for something they're going to engage in the latter, 75, 80 pages of this text, right, later on, right? They're really trying to go there with this, again, what will be opposed, if you will, what will be contrary, the anti-Oedipus will be the schizoid analysis that is going to try to avoid, again, once again, an unconscious that can be re-Oedipalized, or what they call Oedipal psychoanalysis, they want to replace with schizoid analysis.
Mhm.
This is where they're going. So in a way, they're going through, they're historicizing this. You know, the Historia, the Homo Historia is actually working here, that somehow Oedipus, in a way, followed very much, this complex followed very much the development of the bourgeois ego. I mean, they put this in class terms in some ways, which is very interesting to me, the way they do this. You know, they have a section later, we're not there yet. And, you know, next week when we'll go back to what Eloy brought up, but Adam Smith and Freud are very close in some ways. There's a very interesting association there. Yeah, in many ways. Very, very interesting the way they work through this. So you have to think of this also, there's a proposal underway here, right? That is basically, again, like I said last time, there's a scaffolding and a critique going on, and they'll use, this is not language that they're just saying destruction of Oedipus or whatever. They're using a term called holy, you know, familialism of psychoanalysis. The family is an object of, you know, destruction here, because the family is the one that's limiting in a certain way and can recodify within the capitalist, you know, order, right? This is where they're trying to go. That this is what's happening. And yeah, please go ahead. I know we all want to escape our families, but and the Oedipal complexes, or work through them so that we can get to the other side. But please, yeah.
I get that they're proposing a different model of the unconscious that's based more on the schizophrenic rather than the Oedipal neurotic. I think that's what I at least interpret them as doing.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you have to read both symptomatically here, and also retrospectively and prospectively, and also symptomatically, kind of, you know, as much as you can, because that's what's happening in between. They're operating at all these levels. So right now in the holy familialism, we're really in the symptomatology of which the schizoid itself is the result of capitalism.
Right.
You know, schizophrenia is a disease of capitalism. As R.T. Lang said, you know, the schizophrenic is the sanest response to capitalism.
Yes.
Can't maintain the contradictions. They're so vast, right? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Well, they also talk about the schizoid, this is later on, as resisting Oedipalization, that there are some people for whom Oedipalization doesn't take. And so that's
absolutely.
How they understand. I mean, I think
you can't Oedipalize Antonin Artaud. You cannot Oedipalize Frederick Holderlin. You cannot Oedipalize Heinrich von Kleist, Samuel Beckett to a degree, you know, et cetera, et cetera. They have their artists, right?
It seems like maybe, I guess like maybe the way to reconcile, I think that there are these, it's not a tension, but sort of these different ways they come at it, is it seems like what you're saying, I think what they're saying is, they're critiquing any kind of trans-historical aspect of Oedipus, right? That, you know, sort of that it reaches prior back into, you know, this deep human.
Well, Oedipus is a historical invention.
But
it's a narrative.
It's Freud, like, you know, it's all. My understanding is that it's in some way linked to, you know, the slaying of the father. I mean, and then that passage I read where there's this accumulation of past egos in the id, right? So at the time we're born today, it's like we're inheriting, and it seems like what they're trying to do is displace that and say that Oedipus is an operation that emerges out of a certain logic of coding that takes place under capitalism, and that's therefore to decode that logic is part of what I think they're going to propose in schizoanalysis. I mean, that's kind of how I'm putting it together at this point. I don't know if that you would concur, or other people would concur with that.
Yeah, David, I see you're unmuted. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. I was just relating to what Carl was saying. But I had taken a look this week at Holland's book on Deleuze and Guattari. And he had said this, which I'm wondering if this is kind of part of the crux of why Oedipus is sort of, you know, getting in the way, where he was saying for them, the desiring machine operates with three critical syntheses: the connective synthesis of production, the disjunctive synthesis of recording, and the conjunctive synthesis of consumption-consummation, which links them with Kant's purity of the synthesis of apperception. Freud, however, is still important for them by recasting all of this drama and dialogue in terms of the materialistic ontology of repetition, where difference of similarity prevails. I realize that's a lot to say. I don't fully understand it, but it does seem to me there's some way that, like, their notion of Freud is kind of respecting this part of him that says there is a repetition compulsion, but it's just in the Oedipal structure, it's disruptive of all of these syntheses, so you will never get to the synthesis of consumption consummation, which will never give you the Kantian road to a kind of apperception. So the anti-Oedipus is a way of saying you can't really have the Oedipal complex and expect the repetition is going to lead you anywhere, as I see it. It's disruptive of synthetic processes that have to occur psychohistorically and not on a couch.
Right, right. No, that's very well. I mean, it's well put, and I think that Eugene Holland going there in a way is playing much on the Deleuzian moment here of the critical philosophy of Kant. You know, going back to what I talked about. Unfortunately, he doesn't take it to the next level because he's going to keep it within the transcendental apperception of Kant, which is where I accompany all my representations. And I think both of them here in this book are trying to get out of that kind of thinking, that kind of accompanying of representations. They're trying to displace that or decenter that in some ways. But anyway, I'll look at. I mean, I don't have Holland's book, but I can access. I know. Yeah.
But Michael, what would you say? You know, trying to one head around this. What is really the ontology of repetition, where difference of similarity prevails? Is that an idea that you feel is really more Holland's than them? Is there a way of making more sense of it for an amateur like me or the class?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say because I'd have to read his whole article, what he means by difference here, and then similarity in a sense. Again, I think this is a project that unless you have in mind Rimbaud, Season in Hell, I am from another planet, I am not here. And in a way, Rimbaud is another model here, the poet, whose probably metaphysical vision was so great he couldn't tolerate it. Another one like Nietzsche, who went through this moment, right? But in a way, this is a reading of Rimbaud. I am a Negro, I am not from this, I'm not of your stock, etc. Fanon that I read from already. So unless you bring in these factors, I think we're missing something in terms of the importance of this book. Because, right now there's a tendency to westernize them, put them back in the Western philosophical tradition, and these kind of categories, instead of opening it up to, they're looking at something like African Oedipus, where there is no Oedipus, right? In a certain way, to look at it very differently in terms of, a different kind of anthropological subject, if you will. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. I really like. I'll take a look at. I know Eugene Holland's work, and yeah. I mean, I'll take a look at that. I don't know what he means by difference and similarity. Who he's really trying to do, that analysis with. But yeah. But I think, remember, Deleuze writes a book called On Difference and Repetition, right, in a sense, which is a very different repetition than the compulsion to repeat in psychoanalytic thinking. Yeah, I mean.
Could you say more
okay,
about how different than the neurotic repetition compulsion when he uses the word repetition?
I think it's different, yes.
In what way, Michael?
I think it's much more like we read from Nietzsche earlier. That kind of repetition of the same. The eternal recurrence of the same, the eternal repetition of the same and sameness. And right, and this is a very different notion than what we get in terms of the repetition compulsion of the neurotic, in a sense, and the compulsion to repeat.
Like with the neurotic, isn't it about a unresolved fixation?
Yes.
Right, and that you're saying that there's a different idea of repetition that is not about a fixation.
It's not about fixation, and it's not about getting stuck. That's what they're trying to really resolve here, in a sense, right? In many ways. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to
Yeah.
take it back to the issue of synthesis
Okay.
that David mentioned in reference to Holland. The Oedipal complex is a particular configuration of synthesis. And correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding, I'm still kind of trying to figure this out, that the Oedipal complex is really a particular configuration of synthesis. And this kind of connects into Lacan and his notion of language, which happens in very early development. And what they're doing is they are essentially decoupling from the Lacanian framework in terms of the phallus, so it becomes basically a body without an organ. And they're opening it up so that they can rethink the way in which the real is understood.
Yeah, the symbolic order is completely under attack here for the Lacanians here tonight.
It's not under attack. What they're doing is they're questioning a particular configuration of the symbolic order.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, what do people think? I mean, this is
Well, Patrick, could you expand on that a little bit? Like,
I'll try.
Yeah, when you talk about they're attacking a particular configuration of the.
Well, I mean, in Lacan, the development of language happens in relationship with the mother, the mirror stage, and all of this. And the father intervenes at a particular point and essentially establishes the name of the father, the phallus, and all that garbage that's characteristic of Lacan's understanding of Freud. What they're doing is they're saying that, no, that is not what we're at here. What we want to do is we're saying that we're bracketing that. We're basically throwing all of that apparatus into question. And instead, we're maintaining the development of language, but we're looking at it in a fundamentally different way so that we can get at what is going on. And this is where the machinic element comes in, because the machinic element is at the level of the real in terms of the relationship to the body. Yes. and that level. And
body without organs is the real. That's good. Yes, right.
Yeah, the body without the organs is the real. Yeah. And no, I see it, my understanding of history of philosophy is that, yeah, there are breaks, but there are continuities as well. And I can see that there's a lot of Lacan, basically baggage that's being carried over here, but essentially being rethought in a very interesting level. But
yeah. I think you're referring, if I could just interject for a second, to the for-da game and the entry into language of the child, the away, the da, right? And in that, the phonetics is established, the phonemes, the u, the ah, etc. And then this begins a kind of beginning of the language game of which psychoanalysis plays, if to put it in, those kind of terms. Deleuze and Guattari are trying to, think, as you said, think outside of this, right? In a way. Mm-hmm. And maybe it was a bad notion to say an attack by me, an attack on the symbolic order. They want to avoid the symbolic order. The phallus to them is part of the anti-Oedipus, the Oedipal, right? In a sense, it's part of holy familialism. The phallus and the phallocentricity of that moment in some ways, and the symbolic order, the law, if you will, again, which is the law of language and the law of the father and the name of the father that you called garbage, in some ways they would agree, yeah, it's garbage. So let's throw it out with the baby and the bathwater. So yeah, they're working in Lacanian terms, if you want to put it in those terms, in the real and the imaginary, And very well done. I mean, what you say here, and it's very interesting. Yes, they have the baggage, right? They're trying to look at it as a symptom and also trying to work through it to the other end. And I think that what David brought up as well, the notion of the Kantian term, vis-a-vis Eugene Holland and others, and this notion of difference and similarity, is also a way, I think, of putting them back into the history of philosophy rather than their use of philosophy in some ways. This to me is, again, part of maybe sometimes a problem when we bring our prejudices. We have prejudice. I'm totally know that we have prejudice in any reading, et cetera. But in a sense, if we bring too much philosophy and too much of the outside to this, again, we're missing the movement of the flow book, so to speak. Again, I want to emphasize that too. But yeah, I mean, well done, Patrick. Please continue if you want to. Yeah, I mean, this is good that we're discussing this at this point. Or Carl.
No, I don't have. I mean, I've been grappling with the issue of synthesis.
Okay.
And been reading, Repetition and Difference, the book on Kant, and also secondary sources. And
on Deleuze's notion of synthesis.
Yeah, the delusion in terms of, because I think this is critical in terms of getting at what's going on here.
Right.
And
this is not a Hegelian synthesis at work. There are many levels of synthetic activity, and remember, they're going through the connective, right, and the conjunctive at the end, and the "and" is very important to them.
Which is taken out directly out of Kant's transcendental deduction.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. No, good point.
And,
this is Kant against Hegel at one level on a philosophical ground.
Well, we could have some debate there.
Okay, no problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Patrick, when just expand a little bit when you said referenced the Kantian transcendental deduction.
Okay. In Kant's transcendental deduction, what he is doing is he's understanding the way in which we, and people should jump in because my understanding of Kant's been a while, is the way in which we construct reality categorically. Okay, and this is my take on Kant, is that, and it's part of the reason why we don't get at what the underlying noumenal thing in itself, etc., is because we're essentially dealing here with a categorical framework in terms of understanding the world. And so we have Newtonian science and stuff like that. And I think that Deleuze is, I mean, he's definitely operating in terms of Kant's notion of synthesis. But I think, as I think Michael will appreciate, I think there's also the connection to Spinoza. And the connection, I mean, there's a lot of discussion among Kant and Spinoza scholars these days about to what extent Kant, in fact, the influence of Spinoza on Kant, that in fact, pre-critical period, he was Spinocistic, but I don't want to get off onto this tangent.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff that's going on. But essentially what it is that in terms of language, how does language basically mediate reality? How does it take it in? How does it basically organize it so that we, quote unquote, know it? That's what I'm talking about in terms of that.
Right.
So.
That's interesting. I guess I was thinking earlier in this discussion that to me it seems almost like the body without organs is maybe parallel to the Kantian noumenon, which you sort of have to presuppose. You can never directly apprehend. You only know it in the course of the coding operations. That in some sense, I mean that's almost how I see it. Is that what they're talking about is maybe the disjunctive synthesis in particular is how that it's almost like the connective synthesis is space-time, puts things into, and then the disjunctive synthesis is what actually organizes them into sort of parts and discernible objects. It's interesting.
Probably one way of thinking about the conjunctive, the "and," is again, you're in the socius, right? And the socius is really a force field of vectors, right? In a sense, you're really thinking in terms of vectorial things, moments, right? In a sense, you're not just thinking, the normal way we think. This is their notion of the connective, I think, more than of the conjunctive. I'm sorry, the connective is different. I mean, again, they're borrowing so many languages here. They have embryonic, the notion of induction, the embryology of the egg. They describe this early in the text on the body without organs. They talk about fluid dynamics. They use terms of that studies, how fluids go through space, right, as well. So they're borrowing many levels, many contexts. I think the important thing, and I think Patrick is kind of going back there. I don't want to get into the Kant Hegel stuff or the Kant Nietzsche stuff in a way, or in the sense, but I think what really happens here and what they're fighting, if you will, constantly is this yearning, if you will, for the secure madness of the family. That this is the nostalgia that they're fighting, is this secure madness of I can go back to the family. I know my father's going to act this way. I know my mother. I know my siblings. We're all going to meet up on Easter Sunday, or we're going to meet up in Christmas, etc., Thanksgiving dinner, and we're going to see all our various neuroses. And, if we have a little bit of clinical training, we can analyze. I think they really want to get out of that. They really see, the family as an enemy, in a sense, and holy familialism, and this Oedipus as structure, and is really what they're after, if you will, in terms of both a symptom of capitalism and then ultimately is something that has to be thought beyond, in a way to get us out of this. And they also think that the Oedipal thing, in a way, this re-Oedipalization and the re-territorialization by Oedipus is a striving back to some kind of normality, and actually feeds this system in a certain way of adaptation, taking everyday misery, to use the old slogan, and making it into bearable, taking, everyday unhappiness and making it a little more bearable at one level, that kind of pessimistic remark of Freud and towards the end, or adapting to the circumstances, developing coping mechanisms, all of these kind of things. I think they're fighting right throughout. They're really looking for a way out, if you will, a line of flight that it will allow us to kind of be freed from these kind of earlier structures of thinking. And again, they turn again to they're listening not to, quote, the academics, or really to that matter to the philosophers. They're really listening to the artists, the writers of the period. They talk about the machine often. And again, I want to emphasize this. Sometimes you can learn much more from reading Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano than you can from 30 clinical studies, right? Or Juan the Landis of Gostiolo, or, many texts that we have out there, the rereading of fiction, etc. I mean, we read Kafka's Great Wall of China, you can do wonderful things with that today, again, and, etc. The vaccine may be the Great Wall of China now, who knows, but I mean, you can do things like this, which are very different. So anyway, I want to just say that that again, and remember, this is 1972 that's published, and probably mostly, talked about, and this was well put, historicizing it post-May of 68. Remember, this was a time when a lot, was out there, all power to the imagination. The uprisings, May of 68 in Paris, of course, the student uprisings here, the Chicago Convention, many things between 68 till about 71, 72 that go on, the Italian hot autumn, etc. And this was a way of looking at, how do you free in a certain way this kind of dependency on things that we were so accustomed to. It was everything was really under lack of better word, attack, or under scrutiny, and being read as symptomatologies, in a sense. So I think if we can keep this in mind, I think, look, I think it's great we bring Kant in, and, Deleuze has a kind of strange relationship, if you will, to Kant. He wrote one small book, Kant's Critical Philosophy, of which he began with the time is out of joint, right, in terms of temporality in Kant, etc. And and Kant has been absolutely crucial for the development of academic philosophy, and certainly in terms of testing. Most of the SETs are formulated on. Some of you have backgrounds in radical psychology. Phil Brown figured out many of the testing that went on in SATs, and how Kantian formalism was working there. So anyway, but I think we need to, again, somewhat suspend that and look at also what they're really saying about this very, very loaded word, desire and desiring machine. And how do they, work with desire differently than the Freudians, the Lacanians, right? And other, psychoanalytic movements. How do they deal with this? And how are they looking at this through the lens of as revolutionists, right? This to me is part of the project here. One of the ways you actually overcome something. Yeah, David, please. Yeah, I see you're unmuted.
Oh, I was just thinking, because I think, Patrick, I was really appreciating what you were saying about this very close notion of the syntheses.
Right.
Michael, in the way this works for Deleuze and Guattari, are the syntheses things that are happening simultaneously and in a kind of a haphazard way? Or is there a way that the synthesis that's connective of production has to lead into the disjunctive synthesis of recording, has to lead into the conjunctive synthesis of consumption consummation? Like, is it a kind of a stepwise process, or is it?
No, I don't. I don't think it's linear. I don't think it's linear that way. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's more, abstract and more, if you will, circular, concentric in a sense, that you can go from one to the other, et cetera. You can notice where the disjunctive synthesis is going on in many ways, right? Yeah.
Right. And in the final, where it's not really final, but in this, the idea of the conjunction of consumption consummation, for them, I'm just having trouble conceiving what is the consummation in that consumption consummation.
Can you tell me? Yeah. Can you tell me what page you're on? I mean, where the context of that? Yeah, or no?
It's not in them. It's in Holland. I'm sorry about that.
Okay,
So if you want to say, David, hang on with that. I just can't now. I totally get that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, this is part of what Carl brought up last week in terms of the critique of political economy. Marx has this totality at work: production, consumption, distribution, and then, of course, exchange value, which is a very, the way into the critique of political economy. And, I wrote something I was going to put up that, that psychoanalysis needs to face up to the critique of political economy, and to what the secret ideological and historical dimensions are there, and how those categories become manifest in it. So in some ways, I think the use of that language is Marxist language, right? Consummation, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to rethink that. I mean, that may be this section on Proust, on Albertine from In Search of Lost Time. They have a very good section on the character of Albertine and her own consummation. Also, presupposed here once again is this delirium that they think psychoanalysis cannot face completely, right? Delirium of Schreber, right? Where we went through the last 2 weeks in terms of the texts of Freud's, one being, of course, Schreber the Paranoiac, which I reread, Freud's case, very brilliantly written, the judge, he who didn't know, but he wrote about it as a case of paranoia. So in some ways, yes, the delirium is made into paranoia, right, by Freud, and it's kind of re-Oedipalized in a way, and they argue about that too, that these are, again, part of constructs that come out of out of capitalism, in a sense, right? They're kind of thinking this through all the time. So I think the part of the problem in reading a text like this, in terms of a traditional way, is that there's Marx always speaking, behind it, right? In a way, there's always a Marxist, vocabulary, production, consumption, distribution and language, et cetera, right? This is always happening in a way. And they may re-language, savages, barbarians, civilization from that of, the ancient, the feudal, and the modern bourgeois society. But it's interesting because that's when they begin to look again at something that may be what Eugene, I'll take a look at Holland. I'm sorry, I just don't know the work, ready to hand to really give you a good enough commentary on it or extension. But remember, they're looking at inscriptions here too, how we're inscribed by these moments. They're also looking, you're going to see later, they have the founders of the Urstadt, these people that come out of nowhere, right, and found the state, right, which is Nietzsche. And again, Nietzsche is the one that talks about this. So again, look, I mean, if we think about oscillations, intensities, thresholds, these are crucial words for what they're doing here. They're looking at these intensities, between things, right? So I'll look. I think you're referring. I think I'll take a look at it. It's the section on Proust, on Albertine, and the consummation there too. Not the Petite Madeleine, but that this is happening, in many ways.
Michael, just one,
please.
just kind of touches on, I think, a couple of the themes that we've been talking about the synthesis and desire, but this is on it's in the section neurosis and psychosis. In my book, it's page 124. And I really like this passage where they're talking about the family versus kind of the desiring production. And they talk about how the family relentlessly operates on, they're talking about two types of syntheses. Both the synthesis that occurs through the family and then the synthesis that occurs at the level of desiring production, the connective. And so the family relentlessly operates on desiring production, inscribing itself into the recording process of desire, clutching at everything. The family performs a vast appropriation of the productive forces. It displaces and reorganizes. And then a little later on, the inscription performed by the family follows the pattern of its triangle by distinguishing what belongs to the family from what does not. It also cuts inwardly along the lines of differentiation that form global persons. There's mom, there's daddy, there's mommy, there you are, and then there's your sister. Cut into the flow of milk here, it's your brother's turn, don't take a crap here, cut into the stream of shit over there. So they kind of,
Is this section 8 you're reading from?
This is, section 8.
Right. And what paragraph, if you don't mind?
One that starts on the general level. So it's 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, on a more general level, the two types of syntheses, the desiring machines, and on the other, the edible narcissistic machine. Yeah, I mean, this is crucial. This is a very good passage.
Sort of like imposing itself in coding and creating separations and parts. It goes back. I see that as more the operation of what they earlier called the disjunctive synthesis, right, of breaking into parts and creating like delineations. And then they go in the next paragraph, but the desiring machines are at the door. They make everything shake when they enter. And then they talk about this different logic of cuts. But what's to be put in the triangle? How are selections to be made? The father's nose or the mother's ear? Will that do? Can that be retained? What will constitute a good Oedipal incision? The bicycle horn, what is part of the family? So they're talking about there's this logic of connection that doesn't really have anything to do with this triangle. And I just thought that was kind of, and I think they're sort of saying that this is a different level of synthesis that they're trying to kind of recuperate, right? Or sort of, that's how I thought that was a great passage. And I
Right. No, you're right. I'm just going to read the last paragraph. I mean, in a sense, the Oedipal triangle, and this is in about the 5th paragraph. I'm sorry, in my Minnesota edition, page 126, about 6 paragraphs in, we come to the realization that the simple opposition between the two groups and the intra-Oedipal disorder. And again, they're trying to get through the intra-Oedipal. But then on the next page, the Oedipal triangle vibrates and trembles. But is this in terms of the hold over the machine of desires that it constantly guarantees herself, or is this in terms of these machines that escape the Oedipal imprint and cause the triangle to release its grip, or its grip? Where does the resonance of the triangle reach its limit? A familiar romance expresses an effort to save the Oedipal genealogy. Yeah. Anyway, and this is so prevalent in everything in American psychoanalysis, the family romance. I mean, this is a story that just keeps going on time and time again, right? Okay, so anyway, but it also, right, it expresses a free thrust of non-Oedipal genealogy. Fantasies are never pregnant forms, right, but border on frontier phenomena ready to cross over to one side or the other. In short, Oedipus is strictly undecidable. It can be found everywhere, all the more readily for being undecidable. And in this sense, it is correct that to say that Oedipus is strictly good for nothing. So in a way, you get your for and against Oedipus in one swoop here, right? In a sense, right? They're against this re-territorialization, this re-Oedipalization, this re-inscription into family romance, but at the same time, they talk about the border. And we may meet another Oedipus on that border, right? The frontier of, of this, of the fantasy, the undecidable. And he goes to, then they go on to the great poet Gerard de Nerval, who actually went mad too, another mad person, right? He wants Artaud has found his love to be the same as Adrienne, the little girl of his childhood, but he perceives them as identical. And maybe this will help with difference and similarity, right? And Artaud and Adrienne, both in one, are his mother. Will it be said that the identification as a perceptual identity is here a sign of psychosis? Question mark. One that encounters the criterion of reality, the complex invades the psychotic consciousness only at the price of a rupture with the real, whereas in neurosis, the identity remains that of unconscious representations and does not compromise perception. But what is there to gain for inscribing everything in Oedipus, even psychosis? One step further, and Aurélie and Adrienne and the mother are the virgin. Nerval seeks the point where the vibration of the triangle is at its limit. You are simply seeking for drama, says Aurélie. Everything is not inscribed in Oedipus. Without everything, it is extreme fleeing beyond the reach of Oedipus. There's identifications, were not identifications with persons from the viewpoint of perception, but identifications of names with regions of intensity that provide the impetus towards other still more intense regions. Stimuli of one sort or another that set in motion another journey altogether. Stases that prepare for other breakthroughs, other movements where the mother is no longer encountered, but the Virgin and God. And twice I have crossed and conquered the Acheron. Thus the schizoid will accept the reduction of everything to the mother, right? Since it is of no importance whatsoever. He is sure of being able to make everything rise again from the mother and to keep for his own secret use all the virgins that had ever been placed there. Very interesting, right? In a sense. So try to think about it through this poet and this very beautiful, I think example here, right? Everything can be converted into neurosis. This is again what they're trying to trying to avoid, or warped out of the shape into psychosis. It is therefore not in this fashion that the question must be posed. It would be inaccurate to maintain an Oedipal interpretation for the neurosis and to reserve an extra Oedipal explanation for the psychosis. These are not two groups. There's no there are not two groups. There's no difference in nature between neurosis and psychosis. For in every case, desiring production is the cause. Again, the ultimate cause of both the psychotic subversions that shatter Oedipus or overwhelm it, one of the neurotic and of the neurotic reverberations that constitute it. Such a principle takes on its full meaning if it is related to the problem of actual factors. One of the most important parts of psychoanalysis was the evaluation of the role of these actual factors, even in neurosis, insofar as they're distinguishable from the familial infantile factors. All the major dissensions were linked to this evaluation. The difficulties bore on several aspects. First, the nature of these factors, whether somatic, social, metaphysical, whether the famous problems of living, through which a very pure desexualized idealism was introduced into psychoanalysis. I guess they're referring to Alfred Adler in this case and others of that vein. In the second place, the modality of these factors. Did they act in a negative, privative fashion? By mere frustration. Finally, their moment, their own time, was it not self-evident that the actual factor arose afterward and signified recent in opposition to the infantile, the oldest factor that could be sufficiently explained by the familial complex. Even a writer like Reich, so careful to situate desire to the forms of social production, and again, your mentor, your teacher, Carl, to social production, demonstrating therefore that there is no psychoneurosis that is not also an actual neurosis, continues to present the actual factors as acting by means of a repressive deprivation, the sexual stasis, and as arising afterwards, which leads him to maintain a kind of diffuse Oedipulism, since the stasis or the actual privative factor only defines the energy of the neurosis, but not the content that for its own part refers to the infantile Oedipal conflict, this old conflict being reactivated by the actual stasis. But the Oedipalists are not saying anything different from this when they remark that an actual deprivation or frustration cannot be experienced except in the midst of an older internal qualitative contact which blocks not merely the roads prohibited by reality, but also those that reality leaves open and that the ego forbids itself in its turn, the double impasse formula. Could one find examples illustrating the diagram of actual neurosis in the prisoner or the concentration camp victim or the worker harassed by work? It is not certain they would furnish a large quota. Our systematic tendency is not to accept the evident inequities of reality without taking stock of them, without trying to disclose in what sense the disorder of the world is manifested in the subjective order, even if it is with the passing of time inscribed within more or less irreversible structures. We understand this sentence, but we can't help finding its tone disturbing. The following choices imposed on us, and this is their problem with all this. I mean, this is a very good. I'm glad you brought this up, Carl. The following is imposed upon us: either the actual factors conceived in a totally exterior, privative fashion, which is an impossibility, or it descends into an internal qualitative conflict that is necessarily understood in relation to Oedipus. The Oedipus, the fountainhead where the psychoanalyst washes his hands of the world's inequities.
Michael,
Iniquities. Excuse me, inequities. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Confusing in some ways. How do you and other people interpret actual factors? Back on the prior page.
Actual what? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I'm sorry.
The term actual factors. They make that this seems to be
to me that those are social factors, factors of the society itself.
Could it be a reference to Reich?
It could be a reference to Reich as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because the actual neuroses,
right,
as opposed to one based on fantasy.
Right.
I almost read it in the prior page is that they were talking about symptoms.
About who? I'm sorry?
Well, symptoms, or what generates the symptoms. I found this confusing, but the nature of these factors, were they somatic, social, or metaphysical, and then where they talk about their own time, was it not evident that the actual factor arose afterward and signified recent in opposition to the infantile factor? So it almost seems like it's something that's emerging out of the psychological complex. But I actually found it rather, I found this passage that you just read
Right.
the most confusing part of the book in some ways. It seems to me that then they're talking about, there's all these debates within psychoanalysis. Is it, what is the generative mechanism? And then, yeah, but that's how I read it. But then they're saying that no, this is all wrong, that the actual factor is desiring production, that there isn't like some prior complex that then gives rise to the symptom per se. That's, anyway, I don't know. Maybe this is very off.
Yes, Eloy, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just have to confess that this chapter, the savage barbarism and the civilized man, was exciting for me to read, because I felt a little bit in my territory. There is discussion about anthropology, about the state, about the socius. And so I started kind of to map up a little bit in an ABC the things that I try to understand. I try to, with you all, of course, with your help. And so I think, and this is one of the guesses that I have, that in their perspective, the fact that we are desire machines means that, as in French people say, we have a puissance d'exister, the desire to exist, which is consubstantial to us, which is kind of organic to us, right? But the socios, the institutions, the norms inscribes in us forms of control, it tends to territorialize our desire to exist, which is ungovernable. And so out of that emerges a contradiction, out of those norms, out of the families, all the territorializing machinery that exist around that try to territorialize what is ungovernable, which has no borders. It creates a sort of a schizophrenia. And so we are always in the everyday life, every second, grappling with, there is a norm that I have to follow, but at the same time, there is a desire that I would like to as well. And so in that kind of a double movement emerged an schizoid subject. And so it is in that moment, it is in that precise every second, that the possibilities to subvert the socius and the repression upon which our bodies are inscribed through the subsumption and labor, through the fears and so on and so forth, that a contradiction emerged. And so I think that what they say is that that we are ungovernable. There is always a tendency of the socius to govern our puissance d'exister, our will to exist, because we are desiring machines. And I think that they see schizophrenia, schizoid, as a subject that emerged in this context, in the context of history, as they say in the chapter 3, which is ungovernable. It's always trying to transform and always actually grapple with this, transforming and at the same time following the norms, and at the same time uncomfortable with them. And there is this, in that struggle, in that kind of a struggle, there is always an emerging possibility of emancipation and disobedience to the state, to the family, to regulations and fears. That's all what I wanted to say. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's a...
No, it's a very good ABC, as you said, and a very nice map for the next section, part 3, on the savages, barbarians, and civilization section. It's very, very good, because this is when the concepts of territorialization, representation, deterritorialization begin to emerge. And as you said, the schizoid as being outside, if you will, of the norm of society, and also being, in some ways, again, as I mentioned earlier, both the symptom and in some ways thinking through the solution, right? In a way, right? This is another aspect of all this. I mean, just going back to this section on neurosis and psychosis, what they're really showing is this is no longer, I mean, what they're really trying to do, and I'm glad Eloy said that, they're trying to prepare us for the next part, if you will, if you kind of read this, in some kind of logical order, if that's possible. But anyway, they're trying to prepare us for the next section, of which neurosis and psychosis and intra-psychic moments are a thing of the past, right? They become part of the Paleolithic in a certain way. They talk about, they know, they have a notion of the Paleolithic they use for the death of God, and that it finally comes to consciousness, etc., which is kind of interesting. I think this, again, this section, holy familialism, is again is this destruction in the positive sense of a working through Oedipal as a myth, as a legend, as a narrative, as a complex, and then all the problems that it produced in the psychoanalytic movement, and then ultimately how it became an intrapsychic activity at the expense of the social. And we were supposed to, I mean, I hope we have time to get to psychic and social repression today, because what they're really looking at is that what happens with the Oedipal, and again, look, I know this is hard for us to understand. I mean, in a way, they really consider the profession at this time police, right? I mean, I just want to say this: it's a policing, if you will, of the mind. In a way, it's a kind of restoration of the law and order to the psyche, right? And it does not get into the social. When Lacan goes to the 68 to the left bank and meets with the students and said, "You are looking for a master synthesis of Marx and Freud, and here I am," in a way, this is a kind of attack against that kind of synthetic ground, right? In a way. It's Marx by displacing Freud, if you will, in a sense, or a kind of working through a Freud to show the limitations of the intrapsychic. Anyway, I don't want to be here bashing anything in a very generalist moment, but I think they have very good, I mean, if we read this carefully, and maybe I need to do, I guess, harder work because it is dense in terms of, trying to work with this, but I think you mentioned this about the actual, both Patrick and Carl. If on page 120, it's 128 in my book, and I guess it's the paragraph that begins, "We maintain the cause of the disorder in relation to social production." And again, this is about neurosis or psychosis, right, in a way, an intrapsychic conflict, right? In their different or conflicting regimes and the mode of investment the desiring production performs in the system of social production. The actual factor is desiring production insofar it is caught up in this relation, this conflict, and these modalities, nor is the factor either ulterior or privative, being constitutive of the full life of desire, what, Eloy, the power to exist, the bousson d'existence, right? It accompanies this life with every step. It does not arise after Oedipus. It is in no way presupposes an Oedipal organization, nor a pre-Oedipal pre-organization. This is important. On the contrary, it is Oedipus that depends on desiring production. I think this is very important, this passage, right? Either as a stimulus of one form or another, a simple inductor through which the an-Oedipal organization of desiring production is formed, beginning with early childhood, or as an effect of the psychic and social repression imposed on desiring production, which Eloy was speaking to, by social reproduction by means of the family. The term actual is not used because it designates what is most recent, or because it would be opposed to former or infantile. It is used in terms of the difference with respect to virtual, And, this is a very crucial phase for us today, the actual and the virtual. And it is the Oedipus complex that is virtual, either in so much as it is be actualized as a neurotic formation, as a derived effect of the actual factor, or inasmuch as it is dismembered and dissolved in a psychotic formation as a direct effect of this same factor. It is indeed in this sense that the idea of the afterwards seemed to us to be a final paralogism in psychoanalytic theory and practice. Active desiring production, in its very process, invests from the beginning a constellation of somatic, social, and metaphysical relations that do not follow after Oedipal psychological relations, but on the contrary, will be applied or oriented, if better, to the underlying Oedipal constellation defined by reaction, or else will exclude this constellation from the field of investment constituting their activity, or cathexis instead of investment. Good translation of the Freudian word for cathexis. Anyway, undecidable, virtual, reactive, or reactional, right, such as Oedipus. It is only a reactional formation, a formation that results from a reaction to desiring production. Again, that's presupposed always. It is a serious mistake to consider this formation in isolation, abstractly, independently of the actual factor that coexisted with it and to it reacts, right? So that is what psychoanalysis does when it causes itself in Oedipus. Anyway, any comments about this? Again, I think this is crucial, again, for the understanding of what they're up to. Yeah, David? Yeah. No? Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a very good passage, what Eloy was leading to, too, in a sense, that the desiring production, this power to exist and, and et cetera, and desiring production, which again is this socius, the synthesis that is already presupposed, is always already operative, and that Oedipus is a part to the whole, if you will, and is a reaction formation in some ways. Yes, Carl. Yeah.
It seems like, this is the passage that struck me, and it seems again like what they're trying to do is say that Oedipus is not sort of an inherent part of the psyche, but that it is something that is produced by desiring production under a particular set of social circumstances,
right,
in a particular kind of family that acts as the agent of social repression in that society. I mean, that's kind of how I see it. So, and that desiring production could both constitute Oedipus and destroy Oedipus through schizophrenia, which is the operation that some people perform because they can't be Oedipalized or refuse Oedipalization. That's kind of how I.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Patrick, any thoughts about this? You were really on point.
I was just making reference. I mean, the notion of actual neuroses that Reich talked about in terms of, it's based on a real experience. Whereas in Freud, when he gives up early on and focuses mainly on fantasies, that and that's the basis for the development whole, or the power of the Oedipal complex. And what they're trying to do is they're saying that no, it's based on real experience, the trauma that people experience in terms of within their everyday life. And so that was all the point I wanted to make.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Again, I mean, I think we can read again. David, yes, please. I'm sorry. I see you. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just thinking it out. It's a lot.
Hey,
but
it's okay. I mean, look, this is very good. I mean, look, it's a very experimental text, to be honest, and very complicated, and to put it mildly. But please, yeah. You want to? Yeah.
Sounds like for them, the problem though is also with neurosis in general, in that in the fantasied system of a neurotic structure, it's never generating anything real, which is why it's inert and, in their view, needs to be repudiated.
Yeah, in some ways it becomes inert. Yes, that's a good way of looking at it. It almost is serialized, too, right? In a sense, right? It becomes almost serialized as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And again, we used this word fixation earlier. I mean, they're against fixation. I mean, this is the multiplicity here at work. Call 101 DSIR. It's basically their 800 DSIR in a way. It's always a multiplicity of flows that are going on here, right? I mean, in a sense.
Yeah.
This is very different. Yeah.
Could
Yeah, Alita. Yeah.
Could we ask David to expand on that? Maybe everybody else knows, but you talk about fantasy not producing anything real, and then fantasy could therefore also do what is real. Is that in desiring production? What are the distinctions there? You said the fantasy was not producing anything real. That suggests to me that you're looking for fantasy that produces something real. Is that correct?
David,
as I understand their critique of Freud and the Oedipal, that there's a problem with focusing on fantasy as well as fantasy itself as saying you're not really engaging in the releasing of a direct force into the external environment where there would be the reality of something happening. It would be a kind of an inert thing of saying you're on a couch fantasizing about your lost father or whatever you might be fantasizing about, but it's kind of really, I don't think they'd quite put it this way, but a sort of form of mental masturbation unless it's translated into some kind of praxis or action, because it's dismantling or stopping the different focuses of the earlier phases of synthetic processes of conjunction, consummation, the release of a more direct political force. I don't personally agree with this at all. I think fantasies are quite powerful and can be unlocked and can say a lot, but I'm saying that's my sense about where they are. I don't know, as a kind of a novice at getting into Deleuze and Guattari, how true that is.
If I could connect just to what you said, and thank you for that. In some ways, the fantasy for them in this Oedipalization and re-Oedipalization becomes virtual. You're right, and it's not actual. However, for them, they're not against fantasy, or they're not, trying to say fantasy is not there. They're just saying fantasy is real. And they did a lot of, Guattari did a lot of experiments with this. I just want, he, by the way, I'll see if I can find some of this. He put out notebooks about this book, right? And also some of his clinical stuff. He did a lot of work with group fantasy, which he thought was not Oedipal at all, right? And this is partially Guattari speaking in this section. Really more than Deleuze, I think. I'm trying to locate voices and activities here as well. But they're not. They would agree with you saying that fantasy is very powerful, right, etc. But for them, the fantasy in the traditional psychoanalytic encounters, etc., remain virtual, right, in some ways, right? They're not connected to a praxis or to the actual. This is the way they think. So think about that opposition that they're working through here. They're trying to do something with the virtual and the actual. Instead. So they're not, fantasy is very important to them. Fantasy is also part of the thing. So, Justin, did you want, please, Josepha, please,
I think fantasy, if it's part of the virtual, it doesn't mean that it's not real. I think what you were saying.
Right,
I think.
Right.
Look at Deleuze's concept of virtuality. It doesn't mean that it's not real. It's real. I mean, it's like I think the example that I like to use a lot is like language is virtual, but when you speak it, you actualize it. So the fact that sorry, a friend of mine arrived from Texas. But
be careful. Texas is carrying a lot. Be careful. It's a loaded name here.
Fantasy.
Right. Go ahead, please. Josepha. Sorry. Okay. I think she.
I I wanted to just
yeah, please. Yeah, please. Yeah.
all this is I'm trying to absorb it, but I wondered, coming back to the issue of sublimation, and I guess kind of sanctioned sublimation, in some way, does he work to sort of talk about schizoanalysis in terms of desiring production and having new forms of sublimation that are actually in the socius that are acceptable versus pathologized in the way that, maybe David and I sort of think of symptoms as being acceptable or unacceptable. So I just wondered how this is going to play out in terms of acceptable sublimations.
About 5 weeks to go, but anyway, yes, yeah. I mean, I hear you. They do not like the term sublimation, even though that's crucial to Lacan. Yeah, they do not like the term sublimation, and for them, the schizoid is not going to be engaged in sublimated activity, at least in the traditional sense. And then the distinction between the pathological and the normal, and all of this, again, these are two thinkers that are very much against any kind of society of control and use of that kind of language. So I just want to say that, and ultimately, yes, I mean, again, this has a very rich tradition behind it. It's not like they're coming out of left field. Georges Canquillon, and I recommend this book. I would show you a copy of it, but it's in Montreal. As usual, a lot of the good books are up there. But anyway, The Normal and the Pathological is the name of the book, which would, I think, really shift a lot of thinking about how we come to the terminology of pathological and normal. It's a really wonderful text that influenced. He was a teacher of Gilles Deleuze, right? And of course, Guattari knew his work very well. Yeah, and one of the great thinkers of the 20th century Freudian thought. So yes, and then there's a man named Robert Castel, Castel, who also writes on institutions, who's very good, who's a sociologist and a thinker of the moment, and also speaks the language of pathological, normal, etc. So for them, this is not in the cards, right? We'll see later in the schizoid analysis. We're going to talk about this much later. About formations of sovereignty. We're going to talk more about the body without organs and productive connections and all of this, but not really about sublimation so much. Right? Yeah, Bruno. Oh, you have it there. Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's a great. I really recommend this book for everybody, and especially people that are doing clinical practice. This is really one of the great works of French thought in the post-World War II till today thinking. He's a real master. He wrote another book called The Vital Rationalism, too. A very important book. Lectures on ideology and science and ideology and rationality. First rate. He finished philosophy, and then he didn't like philosophy because he didn't have enough contact with human beings, so he became a medical doctor, and he became a teacher of medical practice. He wanted to really be in the mix. So he's really a great figure in the history of thinking. Yeah. And
I had a question, just Jane.
Yeah, sorry.
Elaborate. You said that you and David might make this distinction between like useful and non-useful fantasies, or legitimate, or I don't.
I don't know about that. I think that what Giuseppe was talking about is that Deleuze thinks the virtual is the actual and the actual is the virtual sometimes, right? And like, hey, the real is the rational and the rational is the real. So in some ways, what they're really trying to get away from is that they really think that Oedipus, again, and the role of fantasy in the Oedipal situation is virtuality. Going back to what David mentioned, he used the term mental masturbation in some way, because it doesn't have a connection to, quote, the real, right, in a sense, right, in a way. So they have this distinction that they're operating with, in a sense. They're not against fantasy by any means. It's not anti-fantasy. Like I said, Guattari, and there's a lot of work in here on group fantasy too. if you get to the later sections. There's a lot of sections on this. And is Eloy still here next week when we go to the more anthropological? We're going to see some of this at work in Savages, Barbarians, and Civilization, more of the level of group fantasy and all of this. Again, look, we have to read this also at the level of Frantz Fanon, Maud Manoni, Edmond Orteguez, all these people who are doing clinical work with North African, right, immigration into Paris, right? A lot of case studies that are coming out of this. If you read Fanon and Black Skin, White Mask, you begin to see this at work. He gives a lot of clinical evidence. A lot of his clinical writings are coming out now. In a way, I know we spoke about Said earlier. Are we going to psychoanalyze 1 million Arabs in the world? I don't think so. The other, right, et cetera. And again, I recommend Kwame Toure's later lectures on Moses and monotheism in this group. And again, look, I want to say something. I think that this book, I know it may sound like it's just bashing Freud or whatever. I think there's a very cautious and a very ongoing working through, if you will. It's not like they're just generalizing everything. They're really trying to work through categories. Whether they do so effectively, we don't know. I mean, we maybe can take parts of it and maybe not take some of it and say, this is, some people said this is insane work. Some people, said that it made no sense, right? There were a lot of critiques of this book, as well as a lot of, warm and, excited reception. So, yeah, David, you want to say something else? I mean, yeah, I want to keep this third world, if you will, for lack of a better term, or this kind of, the other as working in psychoanalysis too. And I mean other, not in the sense of the Lacanian other only. Right?
Right. At the time they wrote this, there was a lot of focus that had emerged in clinical psychoanalysis with the phenomenon of desymbolization.
Right.
People like Hannah Siegel who were saying, part of the issue that people have if they can't really work through the integration of, in a Kleinian sense, the good and bad breast, is the idea that there's a kind of meaningless that's kind of collapsed in what they're doing. There's no force to the way their fantasies exist. I remember working with a patient, super bright guy, wrote a lot of books, was a bit of a Proustian person who was, obsessively involved with his own kind of fantasies of various kinds, but was really driven to coprophagia, which is eating feces.
Right.
And in it was such a difficult symptom to work with clinically because it was almost like he was addicted to it. It was almost like in his life he was such a sort of a good boy well into his 50s. But when he did this, combined sometimes with crystal meth, it was as if he had ejected any kind of meaning out of his mind.
Right. Right.
Of saying, I'm just so fused with this act. I'm drugged. I don't know what I'm doing. I want this feces in my mouth. And so over years, there was some degree of meaning that came out of this, of him saying, I'm aware of a lot of early memories of wanting to bite my mother. She was so fragile. I didn't know what was inside her. I was curious. I was envious. I was afraid of her. This was a way of getting at this oral curiosity, almost an epistemophilic impulse, but it had this kind of delicate equilibrium of saying, it's a way of knowing what it is to take the action of biting and eating, something that's sort of quasi-organic. It was inside her body. At one point it came out of it. But it's also a way of not knowing, because as long as I can kind of deflect this here to this feces, I'll never really know the object. It was this kind of desymbolizing force. For them, it feels like they would find that an interesting aspect of behavior because it's an ejection of knowing, which is what they don't want.
Yeah, and that also the old psychoanalytic equation vis-a-vis Ferenczi that money equals shit, right? I mean, in a sense too. That was an old equation of as you know, the ontogenesis of money, right?
Sure.
You know that, yeah. I mean, yeah. But please go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm very interested. I don't mean to, but
Oh,
yeah.
but
So
I
yeah.
feel like kind of like a film like Sallow has a despair in it in that way that the patient did of saying, this is sort of sexual, but it's really kind of negatively erotic because it's turning this into Thanatos. He was aware of saying, I could really kill myself doing this if I eat bad shit. I could, this wasn't clearly eros in the classic sense of the word. In being a very liberal psychoanalytic institute, people were very accepting of saying, just keep following along. Your role as a doctor here isn't to say, hey, you should really stop eating feces. It's going to
Right.
hurt you. You get gram-negative bacteria. You get sick.
Go, go see the movie Salo. Pasolini gave them chocolate when it looked like they were eating. But anyway, eat chocolate instead of the shit. But anyway, yeah.
Right. But for Deleuze and Guattari, is part of the problem, if we go back to the idea of the conjunction of consummation, a way of saying consummation is for them a kind of knowing, and that fantasy could lead to that part of the consummation, whereas this patient was struggling, and patients do. I mean, this was extreme, but I think every neurosis has a component of this,
Yeah, sure.
with saying, I can't consummate. I can behave, I can act out, I can eat feces, people can cut themselves, people can get into destructive relationships, people can do the crazy things they do, but that ultimately there's a way of saying it's inert because you don't know. And for them, the consummation is a way of saying, if you know, and the fantasy works in the service of knowledge rather than obfuscation, then it's released the power, and that's what they want to do by breaking out of the sick fantasy.
That's very, very well put about where they're going, I think, with the group
Okay.
fantasy and all of that. Yeah. And you'll see examples of this in the text. I mean, again, it's a very dense and complicated text, but they do give examples of group fantasy throughout, in terms of who thinks they're whom, other things, in the work, and both in this section and later on, right? Yeah. So
Right.
there is group
Interesting.
fantasy. Yes. Eloy, you wanted to say something, or Bruno? Bruno, you have.
I wanted to, it was so rich, and actually, sorry, Carl, I could also not hear you well today, so I might have missed something that you said. I just want to say that, and I don't know if you touched on this, because it's in the section that you were not all of you focusing on, especially neurosis and psychosis, but this has to do also with the question of fantasy and with what Eloy pointed out that then we'll go into next time, right? I was thinking that the concept of an exit or a line of flight is very important. So I wanted to call attention to a line, 2 lines from page 124, to which I called attention last time already, where they say that the schizo, right, and that has to do with also the question of fantasy. The schizo, that's line, the end of line 1, top of page 124. He is not suffering from a divided self or a shattered Oedipus, but on the contrary, from having been brought back to everything he had left. And I think that this relates to what probably we will see next time, the question of repression on the one hand, and perhaps the most important concept of a limit, because they make so much, right? I mean, over the question of the limit will go, and the neither nor of the limit, right? There is neither on this side nor on that side, which also touches on the threshold, because as they say in A Thousand Plateaus, beyond the limit, you have the threshold. I mean, the threshold is what happens, right? And it touches on the question of the border that Michael, you also mentioned today, and of course in Fanon too. And the colonized world is a world of borders. So I don't know, I just wanted to, highlight these few moments, but especially the question of the limit. And if I may also go back briefly to the reference made to Kant, right, earlier to Immanuel Kant. If I remember correctly, I read that book on Kant by Deleuze many years ago, but I think that he stresses especially the question of the schematism in Kant, which is the most dynamic moment, if you will, in the critique of pure reason, right? I mean, and it is this schematism which goes through, and it is in a sense the same going through of the various syntheses that they speak about, or the flow, right? I mean, or what they will highlight again in the next section that we are reading next time, you know, this constant movement of things, right? Going through the limits, precisely. So I don't know, I was thinking that maybe these are important ways of understanding also what they do in terms of schizoanalysis, which is precisely what is not governable. Someone said, maybe Eloy, what is not reducible to what, you know, to the status quo of Oedipus, of, you know, whatever the neurosis and psychosis that they say, ultimately it's the same, right? But it is this constant moving out and not wanting to be brought back to the home, right? To be trapped again. So I don't know, I just, you know, just some comments.
Bruno, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go to the text because I think you bring up something crucial and it may help as a transition to next week as well for people to reread the section called The Process, the last section of the Holy Familialism at the beginning. And it goes on, the process. And I'm going down, schizophrenia is about 6 lines down under section 9. Schizophrenia as a process is desiring production, but it is this production as it functions at the end, at the limit, as the limit of social production, determined by the conditions of capitalism. This is crucial, right? It is our very own malady, modern man's sickness. The end of history has no other meaning. In it, the two meanings of process meet as the movement of social production that goes to the very extremes of its deterritorialization, and as the movement of metaphysical production that carries desire along with it and reproduces it in a new earth. The desert grows, the sign is near. The schizoid carries along the decoded flows, makes them traverse the desert of the body without organs, where he installs his desiring machines and produces a perpetual outflow of acting forces. He has crossed over the limit, the skids, which maintain the production of desire always at the margins of social production, tangential and always repelled. The schizoid knows how to leave. He has made departure into something as simple as being born or dying. But at the same time, his journey is strangely stationary, in place. He does not speak of another world. He is not from another world. Even when he is displacing himself in space, he is a journey in intensity around the desiring machine that is erected here and remains here. For here's the desert propagated by our world, and also the new earth and the machine that hums around which the schizoids revolve, planets for a new sun. These men of desire, or do they not yet exist, right, in a way, playing on Nietzsche, are like Zarathustra. They know incredible sufferings, vertigos, and sicknesses. They have their specters. They must reinvent each gesture. But such a man produces himself as a free man, irresponsible, solitary, and joyous, finally able to say and do something simple in his own name without asking permission. A desire lacking nothing, a flux that overcomes barriers and codes, a name that no longer designates any ego whatsoever. He has simply ceased being afraid of becoming mad, right? He experiences and lives himself as the sublime, and this is nice, sublime sickness that will no longer affect him. Here, what would a psychiatrist be worth? Anyway, I think, again, this is another passage, the limit, the border, where the schizoid emerges, the difference between, again, desiring production and where they're really trying to go with this, right, in many ways. Again, the emphasis, again, social production created by determined by the conditions of capitalism. Again, they're always going to go back there. This is something that, we get very little of in quote unquote, it's either Marx or Freud, right? We never get both, right? It's kind of interesting, in this way. Where are the limits to capitalism? How does this language reproduce itself in the Oedipalization of everyday life or in the clinical setting? So I think this is important. Anyway, it is on the whole of psychiatry, only Karl Jaspers, and I don't know if anybody, one of the great clinical studies I've read, Van Gogh, Man's Suicide by Society by Karl Jaspers, a brilliant piece on Van Gogh, and Strindberg, August Strindberg, the playwright of the 19th century. Then Lang have grasped what process signified in its fulfillment, and so escape the familialism that is the ordinary bed and board of psychoanalysis and psychiatry. Of course, this is dated. Lang is very popular with the divided self, self and others, the politics of the family, knots, etc., during the late 60s and early 70s, and the experiments with Tavistock. If the human race survives, future men will, I suspect, look back on our enlightened epoch as a veritable age of darkness. They will presumably be able to savor the irony of the situation with more amusement than we can extract from it. The laugh or the joke is on us. They will see that what we call schizophrenia was one of the forms in which, often through quite ordinary people, the light began to break through the cracks in our all too closed minds. Madness need not all be breakdown. It may also be breakthrough. The person, etc. This is Lang speaking, I think, madness and that journey, what could be a breakthrough, not really a breakdown. Madness is not true madness, etc. Right? Anyway, then they go to London and the moment of expanding borders, right? With Turner, the painter, right? Very interesting, right? The flows of the paintings of Turner, right? Turner is there. London, looking at his painting, one understand what it means to scale the wall and yet to remain behind. This is very interesting, this reading, the next page, the visit to London, to cause flows to pass through without knowing any longer whether they are carrying us elsewhere or flowing back over us. Already. The paintings rage over the free period. If the psychiatrist were allowed to speak here, he would talk about the first two, although they're in fact the most reasonable. The first canvases are of end of the world catastrophes, avalanches, storms. That's where Turner begins. The paintings of the second period are somewhat like the delirious reconstruction, where the delirium hides, or rather where it is on a par with a lofty technique inherited from Poussin, Laurent, or the Dutch tradition. The world is reconstructed through archaisms, having a modern function. But something incomparable happens at the level of the paintings of the third period. In the series, Turner does not exhibit, but he keeps secret. It cannot even be said that he is far ahead of his time. There is here something ageless, and that comes from us from an eternal future or flees towards it. The canvas turns in on itself, pierced by a hole, a lake, a flame, a tornado, an explosion. The themes of the preceding paintings are to be found again here, their meaning changed. The canvas is truly broken, sundered by what penetrates it. All that remains is a background of gold and fog, intense, intensive, traversed in depth by what has just sundered its breath, the skids. And again, they're going to talk about this as breakthrough, something different that can be, again, re-traditionalized, re-inscribed, etc. Everything becomes mixed and confused, and it is here that the breakthrough, not the breakdown, occurs, right? Strange angle, and then they go in this whole spiel from Thomas Hardy to Henry Miller, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg about flows and the American thing. So remember, Deleuze also writes books. I guess you know this. He wrote a very good text on sensation and the work of Francis Bacon, a 2-volume study on illusion and sensation. And this is a very, very important text, as well as his cinema books. So this is not a lightweight, bringing this in. This is not Guattari speaking. This is definitely Deleuze here in terms of the painter Turner and what they're doing. And it's not going to happen for them in the neurotic or the psychotic breakdowns or in that tradition. For them, it has to happen about knowing how to leave, the decoded flows, etc. David, I see you're unmuted, please. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just still thinking about it. So interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
I had
okay.
a question.
Yeah.
So this is not to put our clinicians on the spot here, but I was just curious to know what David and Jane, what you think about this, this notion, and what does the field think, so to speak, about, is schizophrenia and madness potentially the most sane reaction to objective social conditions, or is that I'm just very curious about what the thinking is about this and what you think about this. Do you accept this or do you reject it?
Jane, do you want to take a crack at this?
You're still muted. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Jane.
There we
David,
go.
you can go first on this one.
Well, I think there are a couple of things about it where I do think, in getting closer to reading Deleuze and Guattari, I don't think they're really talking about schizophrenia in the way, we really define it in a DSM-5 way of a particular kind of disturbance that's dopaminergically related and has a particular kind of breakdown pattern. I think they're really describing it as a kind of more general metaphoric mental pathology that arises out of, being in a situation where your basic humanity is really reified by an oppressive kind of external cultural structure, which is not letting the synthetic processes we've looked at of conjunction consummation or decodings happen appropriately. I would say the idea that Lang had, and that was kind of big in the 60s of schizophrenia was a kind of a divine madness and you could discover your truth. I really think that has fallen out of favor, and that there is really more of an understanding of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders like that as being much more biochemically mediated problems with dopaminergic disturbances, and that I think it's questionable, but you occasionally do get someone where the psychosis does feel it's revelatory of something. Like I remember as a resident working with a young woman, she was like 22, who had a psychotic delusion. She was a middle-aged man with 2 teenage daughters, which was really a way of having a psychotic identification with her father, in that she had a younger sister. They were both teenagers when she went mad. They hated the father, who was incestuous and inappropriate, and in her madness she did become him. But I think the other part of this, which goes back to earlier in the class, is, to my mind, I think Freud is very sophisticated in later papers like The Neuropsychosis of Defense, where he really does say there that in every neurosis, there's a little psychosis, meaning there is a kind of patch over reality of some kind that has occurred in the neurotic that is blocking out the registration of some kind of reality. And the question, if we look at the Freud classic cases, particularly the Wolfman, the Ratman, Schreber, there is a way that they're probably, by a modern DSM-5 lens, much more than neurotic level people. They have ego disturbances that are more challenging than that. I would say the odd ones out in the clinical pantheon would be Little Hans and Dora, where there's more of a phobia and then there's more of a hysteria. But I think the Ratman, the Wolfman, Schreber are really much more disturbed than that. But I think Freud's great gift was in saying, if we see these people, and he was aware of how, quotes, crazy they were, but if we see them as kind of like blown up under high power, a process of really complicated fetishistic substitutions of reality formations that are more tightly wound together in a more neurotic structure of you find with someone with a phobia, hysteria, some other kind of repetition compulsion thing, that sooner or later the analysis, and this is why clinical work is so tough, is going to have the person have a radical dismantling of their external perception of what reality is. So if I look at my, control case patient with this, compulsion to eat feces, it was the hardest thing for him to spend 8 or 9 years, 4 times a week, saying, what meaning is being avoided and ejected by this? What is being pushed out of my mind? And as he became more symbolizing, a tremendous inner revelation of perceptual impulses, repressed memories, all sorts of difficult stuff. That's the stuff of an intense analysis did come up, which left him saying, I could see this behavior which felt so driven is now something that I'm more able to choose to do or not do. I could do it with safer parameters, things like that. And as he gave it all up, ultimately, he became more depressed because he didn't have this kind of grandiosity as a defense, which was very poignant of saying, when he really took the support, he said, I don't feel like I'm eating feces or people are eating my feces, because I do feel, to go back to Michael's point, he said, I feel like my feces is magic. I feel like it's a form of gold. I feel like it's a form of transformation. I feel like I've become Superboy because I can force myself to eat this. I can be, in a Henry Jamesian way, shuddering in an ecstasy of self-control. Not everyone can do that. I'm special. But that wouldn't be really like in truly like a schizophrenic mode of saying, I'm really hearing a voice, it's a persecutory voice, I'm beginning to feel like I am afraid Martians are putting needles in my liver to plant devices there, that sort of thing. That I think the schizophrenia is really seen very differently, actually.
Just to make a joke, maybe Elon Musk will be doing that.
Right.
Right, anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, back to the real and the virtual here, the actual.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but thank you, David. That's excellent. I mean, for those of you, the ontogenesis of money is a piece by Sandor Ferenczi, Freud's favorite son, by the way, in the early psychoanalytic moment, and where the equation that money equals shit, sublimated shit, or gold, better put, because of the color, right, et cetera, what gold is, right, is a sense was sort of the symbolic moment that Ferenczi came up with in terms of looking at this back in the day, and so anyway, that it's a very interesting case there. Again, yeah, I mean the clinic is always much more revealed. I mean, one of the things that I admire very much about Lacan, he was first a clinician. I mean, amazing theory, but this is someone that he began with the cases of paranoia and a murder, right? That became a famous play, The Maids. This was his dissertation. It was on the Papin sisters, and which became Jean Genet's great play, The Maids, right? On paranoid schizophrenia. And anyway, yeah. So you want to say something else, David, or Jane, please? Yeah. I'm sorry.
Jane, I was curious if you wanted to weigh in a little here.
No, I guess I was just gonna say, in terms of, I mean, there is a phenomena of acute psychosis outside of someone who would be diagnosed with schizophrenia, in the way that you talked about it being a dopamine mediated illness that is acute. And these patients don't have schizophrenia, but maybe there's some way in which the examples given in this book might speak to this is why I'm sort of bringing up the issue of sublimation. I guess in David's case, I was sort of wondering how your patient functioned in the world, but
probably made a lot of money. I'm just kidding. Right.
No, he was he published books. He taught at several Ivy League schools. He was really quite a high performer. who had this interesting sense of saying, I've been so good, I've been so good, I've been so good, and now it's the weekend and I'm become this demonic little boy who goes crazy. I'm going wild now. That he was like that. But it's interesting what you're saying, because it was almost like he created a slight theater of the psychotic of sorts, aided it with a bit of crystal meth, to kind of have an escape almost from the super ego-ridden world of Monday through Friday, where he was publishing and meeting pressures and making administrators happy and being a very good guy.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, recently I read Afro-Pessimism by Frank Wilderson, and there is, he also was a writer. I don't know if anyone read it here, but he has sort of near psychotic episodes in a sense, because I do think he's struggling with aspects of dealing with who he was going to be in a capitalist society and then became paranoid, or also wrote in a way that, his sense of fantasy was able to be portrayed in his writing. But he was also psychiatrically hospitalized too. I forget exactly where that was, with a diagnosis of acute psychotic reaction.
Interesting.
Well, I like the fact that you bring up sublimation, because we're going to come back around to that, because in a way they are, Deleuze and Guattari are basically taking on that concept. Again, they want to avoid going back to traditional terminology, and in some ways the skits and the schizoid analysis is an attempt to stay away from those kind of categories in psychoanalysis. This is really where they're going to go. And I'll try to frame that. I mean, I'm glad you brought up that because that's a crucial concept, of course, to psychoanalysis, and especially to Freud. And the famous joke, of course, with his patient HD, when she said, "Sublimation, what dreary German thought this up in his study?" That was her, Hilda, tribute to HD, as you know, right? So anyway, yeah. So the notion of sublimation, and there's a very good book, by the historian called Social Amnesia by Russell Jacoby, historian from Berkeley, in which he analyzes. He says the problem with our cultural takes on psychoanalysis is we don't analyze the sublimation, why people choose to do what they do, right? In a sense. So, for Jacoby, this was a very neglected part of psychoanalytic thinking. He was taking a kind of Frankfurt School approach to it. Yeah. A book called Social Amnesia. It was a defense of, Freud's 3 essays on infantile sexuality, as well as other parts of Freud that were much more explosive against that of, the neo-Freudian temptation of Horney and, the culturalist tendency, the assimilationist tendency. And what Richard Leeds keeps referring to, and this is a thematic, the Americanization of psychoanalysis. Again, Richard may be right. This is also an attack, if you will, or an attempt to say made in USA ego psychology, is part of our attack. So in that way, they're part of the Lacanian war machine, and
no, I also wanted to just mention in terms of psychedelics coming into the field of psychiatry, which is sort of interesting because in some sense, this is a fostering of a breaking down of boundaries in terms of ego integration and disintegration in order to facilitate. I mean, I know there's ketamine infusions for depression, but there's this whole other sort of thing that's coming up in psychiatry now that's interesting in relation to maybe, a desire for schizoanalysis.
Right. I mean, maybe this book is going to see the light of day again. Maybe we're on a cutting edge here when it comes back in. Big Pharma may fund the Institute for Radical Imagination. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. David, please, yeah. No, this is good. I'm glad we're having this discussion.
This might get us also a little off the main thrust of this, but I think also if we consider, some of the things that have come up like Salo, but I'm thinking of the artist she kind of reminds me of this because there's an extreme. Anna Mendieta, she had a sad story where she was a Cuban artist and she was separated at a very early age from her parents through something called Project Peter Pan, where Castro sent a lot of Cuban children away to the States with the idea they would reunite with their parents. And then sadly, that often didn't happen. It didn't for her. I think her parents were actually murdered. But she became very noted in her art for these very powerful body sculptures where she would lay in the earth and trace the contour of her body and then pour gasoline on that and light it on fire as kind of process art. Where she would kind of trace scaffolds of herself and set explosives off at festivals and things like that. And ultimately, like one of her last installations was her lying in a coffin with a sheet soaked in goat's blood. And about a week after that, under very mysterious circumstances, she either jumped out of, or it was argued that her husband, the sculptor Carl Andre, pushed her out the window of their loft in Soho. And there was a big trial. It was kind of like an O.J. Simpson sort of thing about Carl Andre, where it seemed like that he kind of had done this. They had a very tempestuous marriage.
Althusarians have a tendency.
Uh-huh. But that
big Althusarian, by the way.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, Carl Andre was a very avid reader of Louis Althusser and used the theory in his work, The Sculptor. Yeah.
Right. But he did use all that and more and his attorneys
yes,
to argue based on the quality of Anna's work, which he said had stopped sublimating, that it was no longer a sublimation of self-destruction or aggression or any of these things, that she was crossing a line, almost like a kind of a reactive psychosis of saying, you're no longer creating a contained artwork that sublimates it impulses, you're mixed up, this is crazy work, you're covered in blood, you're exploding, you're doing all these things. This is why you're so unstable. You can't sublimate successfully anymore. That function is broken down. You've thrown yourself out the window, and I'm innocent of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other question is we sometimes see with art of a particular sort is that it, in having the capacities to sublimate, also becomes more perverse in its revelation. So if we consider, say, someone like Janina Antoni, she had a series called the Gnaw series, which were these huge slabs, monolithic sizes of chocolate or lard, combined with these little small sculptures that were super realistic of her face in either chocolate or lard. And at night, she would go into the studio and gnaw on this. And a lot of neo-Kleinians wrote a lot about her because it was felt, she was so interesting about, oral aggression and trajective processes, the idea of the absent presence where she wasn't there, but you saw what she gnawed. But it was felt that it was kind of arguably the function of the perverse in a Freudian way, because the idea is the perversion unwraps the instinct, meaning it shows the source, where in the body it's coming from, the mouth. The aim, does it suck? Does it penetrate? Does it chew? In her case, there was all this biting. And what is it directed towards? In this case, not a person, but this either massive thing, like a kind of almost monolith parental substitute, a huge block of chocolate, a huge block of fat, and then the idea of chewing your own face, which is really quite a weird thing to do when you think about it. The idea of biting an image of your own cheeks, that's just so weird at so many levels. But I think it kind of looks at the question, I don't know how this gets us to schizanalysis and all of this, but
right.
Artwork that sometimes holds up a mirror that in a sense shocks the audience so much that it either enlivens it, it awakens it, or in the case of a film like Sallow, I've always been struck by this, but even though that was closed down in Italy by the respective ministries of spectacle and culture, that it almost didn't need to be because nobody really went to it. I mean, the few people who did mostly did walk out. I actually showed that movie at an organization for residents interested in psychoanalysis. They stayed. I was very struck by that because I think their medical training socialize them to say you are going to see something kind of repulsive here at the New York Academy of Medicine.
Yeah, I know
But
people who saw it in Paris, and of an audience of 55 stayed for the after the first 15, 20 minutes. So to give you an idea of how much shock value it had during a period. Right.
right.
And
But it was the summer of that in 1976 and Lena Wertmüller's film on fascism, Seven Beauties.
right.
And Seven Beauties arguably had much more sublimatory capacities to it because it was a dark movie. It was about the Holocaust. It was about this kind of sort of Southern Italian gigolo who winds up being in a concentration camp. It's not pretty, but she manages to also balance the rawness with this tremendous humor, wit, and cinematographic quality of an illusion, which makes you be able to take it. The public flocked to it. It was one of the highest grossing European films ever in Europe and in America.
More than Swept Away for earlier. Yeah.
And whereas Sallow was so kind of glacially just real, so slow, so just there's nothing in any way you could ever call entertaining about that film, that it just was too much in some way. Again, I'm not sure where this gets us with Deleuze and Guattari, but clinically, I think to go back to your
I mean, look, they're certainly studying both historical psychoanalysis and historical fascism, but they're also studying, again, these forms desire, right? I mean, this is really the object here, right? Desire before sublimation, if you will, and how these reactionary tendencies, how the fascist in us is activated. What we talked about at the beginning today. How is it possible that the masses, who know what's going on, just go along with it, right? And what formation is that that's playing out? So in a way, the question of psychoanalysis becomes a very rigorous political question, I think, as you go forward. How is this kind of thing, both prevented in the future? The case of this, I forgot her name. I think we're going to try to interview her. Oh God, what's her name? The woman, Brandy is her name, at Yale, the psycho. Yeah, she just, she did the Trump study, and now she's being called out. I mean, this is an example of social repression at work right now in front of us, right? Yeah. Sandy Brandy, what was the brand? Anyway.
It's Brandy Exley.
Yeah.
So Yale dismissed her. They took her appointment away.
Yeah, that's right. She's suing Yale. Yeah, she's underway. So anyway, I mean, but this is someone who actually uses psychoanalysis and psychology, if you will, as a tool. And all she did was make generalized comments about, Trump and, and other figures.
It was Dershowitz where she got herself in trouble. It wasn't Trump. Once she started to play with Dershowitz, that's when.
That's correct. Very, very good. Yeah.
But it also does show you how sadly conservatized psychiatry is under the APA, where there is actually a law she did break that says you can't speak publicly about a public figure.
The Goldwater law, right? The Goldwater rule, is the name of the rule, yeah.
And why is there this rule? But I mean, there is, and the APA consented.
Well, that's the question nobody's asking. Why is there this rule? That's the first question. Nobody's asked that question. You should write something for the Times or whatever. Maybe not the Times audio. But anyway, this is good. Yeah, why is there such a rule? At this point. Yeah. In some ways.
I mean, it does feel like it is totally like a freedom of expression that's banned to say you can say what you want. I mean, you're not there telling the world this person is, a horrible person. You are using intelligence to explain why the phenomenon's happening, and that's outlawed in the
Tony put in the chat, no one gets to play with Alan Dershowitz, right?
Right. He has the final.
Just to go back, David, that it was very interesting what you said when you at the start, where you were talking about your read of what they mean by schizophrenia, that it's not really being used in a clinical sense. And I just find this question really interesting, and hopefully we can kind of keep revisiting it, because there clearly, Tavistock and some of these others, where the idea is, I understood it was to actually allow the psychotic break to occur, and if you did not interrupt it with various interventions, treatments, medications, that it would have a kind of a tendency to self-resolve or to, and I think that was, the idea there. And it seems like, there's been a massive shift in terms of a more biological understanding. So it seems like part of what we will, would need to do is kind of rework this concept in some sense in terms of current understandings and maybe some modifications.
Yeah, I think that both David and Jane can attest to this. I mean, schizophrenia is now in the hands of pharma, right? In a way. I mean, basically, you're treated with drugs, and they have all kinds of new competing drugs on the market, and they have indications of some hope here, et cetera, that maybe this can be, managed or whatever. I think Deleuze and Guattari are up to completely something different here. I mean, they're not interested in, big pharma and the relationship. I mean, they're more interested in what Jane mentioned earlier about psychedelic drugs. Is another thing. Yeah, I mean,
in part as
that,
sort of a model of these,
Yeah.
But it was interesting again what David was saying about how, that example of a kind of a decomposition, a sort of a lack of ability to achieve any kind of positive reconciliation. Right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, just like the model. I mean, I find it fascinating what they're doing with this model of schizophrenia as sort of like the model of desiring production. That's where they start.
Right.
Right.
Remember, connected synthesis, capitalism and schizophrenia. It's not schizophrenia itself as an object of study. It's the relationship of schizophrenia to capitalism, and schizoid analysis begins a new form of investigation, that was to replace, if you will, psychoanalysis, or supplement it, maybe in a better way put for our purposes today. Yeah, David, please. I'm sorry.
Michael, I wonder if you'd agree with this.
Yeah, you Lord. Go ahead, David.
I like to talk. I am a desiring as well.
Okay. Go ahead, Eloy. Go ahead. You're going to give us the barbarian, savage, and civilization perspective here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm interested in understanding what is schizophrenia all about here. I, of course, think it's not a clinical observation, but I think that it's an experience. It's a very intense experience. It's the experience of the contradiction between our desires and the social that governs our desires. But I think that he says that what produced schizophrenia is capitalism, because it creates a contradiction as well. It unleash our desires, and at the same time, it subsume us, our bodies. It submit us to discipline, to the reign of history, he called it. A time that is measured and governed by the clock, the control, the discipline. And so I think that out of that contradiction between the desires machine that we are, that work in different ways, the demands of discipline that creates history and capital and the institutions, and also the demands of our wills to exist is what creates our status of schizophrenia. And I don't think he's doing it in a bad way. I think that he offers, I think it's probably poor my interpretation, but I think it's a side of resistance as well. And it's very interesting to recall that they were friends of Artaud, the guy who lived for a year with indigenous peoples in Mexico consuming peyotes. Mm-hmm. And he used to say that the way in which you can really transcend the constraints of the modernity of the world is precisely by consuming peyotes. And he wrote a book, beautiful book about it, that is called The Danza of Peyotes. And it's one of the inspirations of them. I think they in that experience of contradiction, or in schizophrenia, the consumption of drugs remains a site of resistance to the capitalist discipline. It's an affirmation of life and desire, I think. Yes. So just an interpretation, probably very, very schematic, very poor, but I would like to.
No, I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up about Artaud. Please continue. I'm sorry.
And I think in the issue of servitude, what is servitude? It's precisely the government of the discipline, the outside. and also, of course, that we are governed by desires produced by capitalism, by the enlargement of desires. And so also that creates a contradiction. And I think, but how to overcome servitude in the context of we are always, how to overcome servitude and capitalism, and so that's the question I would like to wrestle with. I think that they, as Foucault thinks, that in the everyday life we encounter in every moment power, and we encounter also the choice, the possibilities of obeying power, submitting ourselves to it, submit to servitude, and to submit to death, or to submit to a revolutionary act that it can be consumption of drugs. It can be have sex out of the, the partial destruction of the family. It can be through, I don't know, love for philosophy or stopping working. It can be in different ways. And I think that, so in our everyday life, we find the site for resistance to servitude. We have to be connected with the disobedient state of our schizophrenia. We have to stop being too disciplined.
Hold that metaphor. That's a great metaphor.
And that is a revolutionary act. We can make the revolution every moment happens. Every time when we interrupt or disrupt conversation. Sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay. It's excellent. It's excellent. I just, I want to go back to what you mentioned about Antonin Artaud. At one level, this book is a meditation on exactly what you talked about, that he escaped as a schizoid in a certain way through the indigenous and through the theater of cruelty, which is basically a way of destroying representation. Theater of cruelty is the last kind of, before the living theater and Grotowski's theater of the poor that took on a kind of avant-garde moment in New York in the 60s. The theater of cruelty was a way of dismantling all kinds of forms of sublimation and really showing what things are really made of. And at the same time, a kind of celebration, as you said, of the culture of piety, right, and et cetera. And they'll make mention of this in the book. And the other thing, another meditation, of course, with Boy with Machine, done by Linder, the artist that I mentioned earlier, who was part of the German Expressionist movement. So you have these two kind of models that they're always thinking through, as well as, the flows that happen in terms of the American frontier, the Kerouac on the road. They're not staying around, the Ginsberg, the Beats, these kind of things. And of course, Deleuze writes a very long commentary on Fitzgerald's Crack Up. He loves that book. He doesn't read Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby like we do, or This Side of Paradise, or Tender is the Night, which is actually a story of an obsessive psychiatrist with his patient. Dick Diver and Nicole, I think, were the titles made into a movie. But anyway, all to say, I think again, they're really looking at the cracks, right? The fissures, if you will, always. This is where they're oriented towards. And for them, the problem, and going back, Jane, instead of sublimation, right, which they consider a dualism that happens between desiring machines and social production, they consider this a dualism, sublimation. They're really interested in direct desire, investing the social field by direct desire. There's no such thing for sublimation for them in the schizoid analysis. And we'll go further into that, what that possibly could mean. But for them, sublimation is this dualism, this binary that is still operative between the desiring machine and social production. So I'm really glad you brought up Artaud, because he's crucial for this. Very, very, very much crucial. Yeah, David, what did you want to add? To this.
I just want to say, Michael, for you, like if you think about this, would you say for them, kind of schizoanalysis would be sort of like the world of, say, Fight Club? Ed Norton is the kind of classically just schizoidal, burnt down guy goes to the job. He calculates when to do a recall if a car bursts into flame and kills people, and then he has to do paperwork about that. In the meantime, he's sort of consumeristically buying little, pieces of furniture for his house and looking at catalogs. But then suddenly, beneath the consumerism, beneath the deadness, he meets Tyler Durden. It's not schizophrenia in the formal sense, but there's a fissure in his mind. It suddenly opens him up to the Nietzschean Übermensch of Brad Pitt's Tyler Durden, who's a radical anarchist who's blowing up the world.
Right. No, that's an interesting read of Fight Club. I like that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one certain possibility. Whereas you can see in a film like The Hustler, it's re-edicalization all the way. It's the stick, the pull stick. I don't know if you remember the very redemptive theme at the end with Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason and George C. Scott. They're nothing but triangulations in The Hustler. The great Rawson's film. So I read Rawson as this is his apologetic for naming names. But anyway, this is another kind of return of the repressed for him in terms of 1952, 53 when he named names.
Possibly, I mean, one of the things I'm curious to see where they go with all this is that I think that I don't think that you can resolve these problems they're talking about through individual action. I mean, I think that particularly from a Marxist standpoint, there has to be a capacity for collectivity.
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see what they do if it returns with the notion of group fantasy, because I thought we talked earlier about that's very much a form of production that is able to de-reify an existing set of social institutions and actually transform them. So you do have to have the moment, not just of the individual negation, but also of the kind of the collective transformation. And how does that take place?
On the level of a very direct, unmediated approach to this, desire is really going to end up being revolutionary. That's what they're really trying to get to. They don't want reactionary fascist desire. They're trying to get away from that. They're really trying to get to this. And again, the skits, the fissure, and the break is the indication of that movement, that flight out of, that really demonstrates the desire itself. Direct desire is something that is revolutionary in force and activity. This is their Nietzschean moment. What Eloy spoke about, the power to exist, the will to exist. Or the desire to exist. Sens in French is a very powerful word. The power really to exist, the very deep power to do so, and the potential as well to exist. So in some ways, I think this is where they're going. Yes, David, again, yeah.
No, I was just looking over my notes there, Michael, but thank you.
Yeah, okay. And Carl, you wanted to, I mean, I'm just trying to, redirect back to the
Well, I think I understand all that. Again, I think that for me anyway, that there is the question of political practice, and there's also, I mean, there is something very time bound about this idea of the liberation of desire, and that desire has this sort of inherent revolutionary quality, and then the question becomes, how does capitalism continually recuperate and recapture and rechannel that, which I know that that's part of.
Well, let me ask a question. This is a question that I have. I mean, I've thought about this in a way. Why does it take the retail, restaurant, wholesale workers of America to have to go in and try to attempt to unionize? Not that I'm against this. I'm all for it. I'll even send money, or I may even go down there. I have a friend that lives near there, and maybe go visit. But anyway, all to say, why does it take this outside force, this traditional kind of unionism, to go in and work with a Black community of Amazon workers? Why isn't this already presupposed at every Amazon facility in the world in terms of an uprising, right? In a way, a complete work slowdown, a sabotage, etc. Can they really go through a 3-day to 5-day strike? Can you hit back at them? Why isn't this happening? This is a question that I have. I'm not trying to be an idealist here or do some epic film, but it's a real question about desire. How has desire been coded to this point of where this kind of moderate servitude, a little better servitude, is desired rather than, taking down the machinery or stopping it in a certain way? I just asked this question. I mean, I'm an adolescent revolutionary in this context. Right? I'm sorry.
That is the question. And
yeah.
I mean, that unpacking is.
How do we get to this point? I mean, I'm around a bunch of academics. All they give a damn about is as long as that they're going to get their workload met. They don't care about working conditions, students, etc. The same thing happens in almost every field today. It's wonderful to have, 2, 3 clinicians here that are really care and really are trying to, engage at this level. I mean, but this isn't most of the professions today. Everything is about the security, and again, they're against this kind of security principle. I mean, this is a very real thing that, this is the enemy. This was the enemy to Nietzsche. This was the enemy. Marx and Nietzsche had one thing basically in common, maybe two. One thing they had in common, they couldn't stand the bourgeoisie, both of them. Right? In different ways. They couldn't stand the inertia, the complacency. They couldn't stand any of this, right? At all, these values, etc. And Nietzsche and Marx both didn't like Jugend during socialism for different reasons, of course. But they both had that in common. Both had very ugly things to say about Jugend during socialism. But all to say, this to me is what this book is trying to do at another level, at least for my purposes. It's an extension, if you will, of Reich's mass psychology of fascism, character analysis, and at a different level, listen, little man, in a way. It's also a continuation of voluntary servitude. It's trying to look at this. How does this happen in terms of, history? And they're trying to relate this to the system itself and how it happens. And then what's complicit here about, Oedipus, as a structure and as a practice in this history? How does it contribute to this re-normalization, if you will, this re-entry in some ways? Yeah. I mean, please, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, no, I've just got to jump off.
So, yeah, I think, okay, all right, no problem.
See you all next week.
Okay. Yeah, okay, good, all right, yeah. Well, this was good. I mean, I don't want to keep people, I'm like those people that don't sleep and, don't eat. I go to the bathroom, but I don't play around with it anymore. I like real chocolate. I have very good chocolate Adirondack Forest. I'm addicted to the chocolate ice cream. So, okay, good. Okay, and I'll see you next week, and some very good questions that we'll be addressing. And thank you, Jane. That was great about sublimation. We can really work with that going forward. Thank you.
Raise the point of
Patrick, for your interventions on symbolic order and other matters and language and all that. Good. Okay. Thank you. Good. And Phil, good to see you, man. How you doing? Yeah. You good?
Yeah, I'm doing good.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad. Good. You're in New York or you're on the road?
No, I'm in New York.
Okay. All right. Good.
Yeah.
Everything's cool. Are you healthy and everything? And
yeah, my health is pretty much